The telephone exchange in downtown Minneapolis hummed with its familiar mechanical symphony on a Thursday morning in 1987. Rows of operators sat before switchboards that stretched across an entire floor, their hands moving in practiced rhythm as they connected calls across the city and beyond. The equipment filled 3 rooms, vacuum tubes glowing amber in steel racks that required constant maintenance and generated enough heat to warm the building through winter. When someone in Minneapolis needed to reach someone in Seattle, the signal travelled through a chain of exchanges, each one staffed, each one dependent on protocols refined over decades. The system worked because people made it work, and it worked reliably enough that no one thought much about alternatives. This was the world that silicon built slowly. The semiconductor revolution that had once seemed imminent in the 1950s and 60s had instead become a grinding technical challenge, a material science problem that refused to yield to simple solutions. The precision required to etch circuits at scale, the purity needed in the silicon itself, the manufacturing environments that could maintain tolerances measured in millionths of an inch. All of it proved harder than the early optimists had imagined. Labs could build small batches of integrated circuits, and governments could fund specialized computers for defense and research. But the exponential cheapening that would have put microchips into everything never arrived on schedule. Instead, it arrived in pieces, in fits and starts, always promising to be just a few years away. So the world adapted by investing deeper into what already worked. The Bell system, rather than being displaced by digital switches in the 1970s, became more sophisticated in its analog complexity. Crossbar switches grew more refined, with mechanical selectors that could handle thousands of simultaneous connections. The engineering was beautiful in its own way, a kind of industrial ballet where physical components moved with split-second precision. Engineers who might have designed microprocessors in another timeline instead became masters of relay logic and stepping switches. Universities trained specialists in vacuum tube design, in the arcane mathematics of signal propagation through copper wire, in the art of maintaining mechanical systems that could run for decades if properly tended. The infrastructure grew denser, more robust, more interconnected, just not smaller, not cooler, not cheaper at the exponential rate that would have changed everything. Cities in 1987 looked modern in most ways. Buildings rose tall, cars filled highways, jets crossed continents. But the texture of daily life retained a mechanical quality that would have faded earlier in another timeline. Banks employed armies of clerks to process checks and maintain ledgers, with early mainframe computers handling only the most repetitive calculations. A single computer installation might serve an entire bank's regional operations, its processing time carefully rationed among departments. The machines themselves occupied climate-controlled rooms, tended by specialists in white coats who loaded programs from magnetic tape and submitted job queues that might not complete until the next morning. Computing happened, but it happened at a remove, mediated by professionals who translated human needs into punch cards and returned results on green-striped paper. The long-haul trucking industry ran on a combination of radio dispatch, printed route schedules, and the accumulated knowledge of drivers and depot managers. A shipment from Los Angeles to Chicago required coordination among dozens of people, dispatchers updating status boards with grease pencils, warehousemen checking manifests against physical cargo, drivers calling in from truck stops to report progress and receive new instructions. The system moved millions of tons across the continent efficiently enough to support a consumer economy, but it moved with human friction at every node. When a truck broke down or a blizzard closed a pass, the information propagated through telephone calls and radio checks, and solutions emerged from conversations between people who understood the network's rhythms. Software would have optimized these routes, compressed the communication loops, reduced the workforce. Without it, the industry employed more people and moved a bit slower, building redundancy through human judgment rather than algorithmic precision. Television in 1987 still meant gathering around the set at particular times to watch scheduled programs. 3 major networks dominated the landscape, joined by a handful of independents and the slowly growing public broadcasting system. Cable television existed in cities, offering perhaps 20 or 30 channels, but most of them showed the same recycled content on different schedules. The idea of video on demand remained purely theoretical, discussed in technical journals as something that might arrive when storage and transmission became cheap enough. In practice, people planned their evenings around broadcasts, and missed episodes simply vanished, unless you'd thought to set up a VCR, which itself was an expensive luxury that required careful attention to timer settings and tape management. The cultural effect was a kind of shared tempo. Millions of people watching the same thing at the same time, discussing it the next day at work or school, creating a common reference frame that would fragment later but remained intact for now. Music travelled on vinyl records, cassette tapes, and increasingly on compact discs, which represented one of the few consumer applications of advanced semiconductor technology that had made it to market, albeit at high cost. A CD player in 1987 cost what a good television cost, a device for people with money to spend on fidelity. For most people, music meant radio stations curated by humans, record stores organised by genre, and the physical act of selecting something to listen to. Building a music collection took years and money. You bought albums based on a single you'd heard, on a friend's recommendation, on cover art and liner notes. The music itself came from studios, pressed in factories, distributed through wholesalers, and sold in stores staffed by people who knew their inventory. The whole supply chain remained visible and tactile in a way that would dissolve once distribution became a matter of copying files. International communication retained a sense of weight and occasion. Calling overseas required booking a call through an operator, waiting for a connection to be established through undersea cables and landlines, and speaking over a delay that reminded you of the distance. The call cost dollars per minute, so conversations stayed focused and brief. Letters remained the primary way to maintain relationships across oceans, and they travelled at the speed of ships and planes, arriving in batches that created their own rhythm of waiting and response. Businesses with international operations maintained telex networks, sending typed messages through dedicated lines, each transmission recorded on paper tape that could be verified and archived. The world was connected, but the connections required effort and intention, and they left traces in physical records rather than vanishing into server logs. Weather forecasting had improved dramatically since mid-century, but it improved through denser networks of ground stations, radar installations, and weather balloons, rather than through satellite constellations and numerical models running on supercomputers. The National Weather Service employed thousands of observers who recorded conditions by hand and transmitted them through teleprinter networks. Forecasters studied pressure maps drawn by technicians, consulted printed tables of historical patterns, and made predictions based on experience and analog models. The forecasts were good enough to save lives during severe weather, good enough to help farmers and airlines plan, but they remained uncertain beyond 3 days and often missed small-scale events. Hurricanes could still surprise coastal towns, and tornado warnings came minutes before the storm rather than hours. Space remained expensive and difficult in ways that constrained ambition. Satellites existed, but they were large, heavy, and built with vacuum tubes and discrete components that made them power-hungry and short-lived. The cost per pound to orbit remained high enough that every satellite launch required extensive justification, and the satellites themselves, once aloft, provided limited service before failing or drifting. Navigation systems existed for military and commercial shipping, using networks of ground-based transmitters that covered regions rather than the globe. The idea of a civilian navigation system accessible to anyone with a handheld device was technically imaginable, but economically absurd given the cost of the electronics. Most people navigated with paper maps, with landmarks and route numbers, with the skill of reading road signs and asking for directions. The Soviet Union and the United States remained locked in their cold competition, but the character of the rivalry had evolved. Without the rapid advancement of miniaturized computing, military technology progressed along different lines. Missiles grew more accurate through better manufacturing and gyroscopes rather than through sophisticated guidance computers. Intelligence work remained labor-intensive, with thousands of analysts poring over intercepted communications, satellite photographs, and human intelligence reports. Code breaking happened through mathematical insight and electromechanical bombs that filled warehouses, not through software running on cheap processors. The advantage in this competition went to nations that could educate large numbers of engineers, maintain vast communications networks, and coordinate complex operations through disciplined hierarchies. Both superpowers excelled at these things, so the balance remained tense but stable. Japan and West Germany had rebuilt their economies through manufacturing discipline and engineering education, becoming exporters of precision machinery, automobiles, chemicals, and instruments. Their success came not from dominating software platforms, but from mastering the production of complex physical goods. Cameras with mechanical shutters that could fire thousands of times without failure, machine tools that held tolerances measured in microns, automobiles assembled with quality control that reduced defects to statistical noise. These were economies built on the refinement of mechanical and analog technologies, on workforces trained to maintain and improve systems that required human attention. When electronic components were needed, they built them slowly and carefully, treating each chip as a crafted component rather than a commodity. In smaller ways, daily life retained a texture that would seem strange to someone from a fully digitized timeline. Grocery stores used mechanical cash registers that required cashiers to enter prices by hand, reading tags and remembering codes, calculating change mentally or with quick arithmetic. Shopping meant walking through aisles, selecting items based on what was physically present, and waiting in lines staffed by people. Inventory management happened through periodic counts and manual reordering based on experience and seasonal patterns. The system worked, but it required more workers and tolerated more error, more waste, more inefficiency than optimized algorithms would later permit. Classrooms in 1987 looked much as they had in 1967. Chalkboards, overhead projectors, textbooks shared among students who wrote their names on the inside cover. Teachers lectured and assigned readings from anthologies that stayed in print for years. Research meant going to libraries, consulting card catalogues, requesting books through interlibrary loan systems that shipped physical volumes between institutions. Students learned to take notes, to remember what they'd read, to develop internal databases of knowledge because external databases remained institutional resources accessible only through librarians and specialists. Education happened at the speed of reading and conversation, and learning to find information was as important as learning the information itself. Medicine advanced through clinical trials, improved surgical techniques and pharmaceutical development, but diagnostic technology remained limited by the cost of imaging and analysis equipment. X-rays were common, but CT scanners were rare and expensive, found only in major hospitals. Each scan required expert interpretation by radiologists who had trained for years to recognize patterns in grayscale images. Electrocardiograms traced signals on paper strips, and doctors read them by eye, comparing waveforms to remembered examples. Laboratory tests happened in centralized facilities, where technicians ran samples through chemical assays and optical instruments, recording results on forms that were mailed to physicians. The practice of medicine retained more art, more reliance on physical examination and patient history, because technological shortcuts cost too much for routine use. Privacy in this world was protected less by law than by the practical difficulty of collecting and processing information at scale. Databases existed, but they were fragmented and isolated, maintained on systems that couldn't easily talk to each other. Sharing records between agencies or companies required physical transfer of tapes or printouts, agreements about format and meaning, and substantial effort. Surveillance happened through human observers, through cameras that recorded on film that had to be developed and reviewed, through telephone taps that produced reels of tape that someone had to listen to. The capacity for tracking people's movements and transactions remained limited by the cost of collection and storage, which created a practical zone of anonymity for most people most of the time. Money remained substantially physical. People cashed paychecks at banks, carried cash for daily purchases, wrote checks for larger transactions. Credit cards existed, but processing them required phone calls to authorization centers or mechanical imprinters that pressed card details onto carbon paper forms. The transaction created multiple physical copies that had to be reconciled later through batches of paper sent to processing centers. The system generated friction that discouraged casual spending and created float time between purchase and payment. Banking happened during banking hours, in buildings staffed by tellers who knew regular customers and could make judgments about unusual requests. The relationship between person and money remained more tangible, more local, more mediated by human interaction. Then, in the early 1990s, the breakthrough arrived. Materials science achieved the purity and precision that mass semiconductor manufacturing required. New fabrication techniques made it economically viable to etch millions of transistors onto silicon wafers with acceptable yields. The dam broke not gradually but in a flood, as decades of accumulated theoretical knowledge and pent-up demand met manufacturing capability. Within 5 years, the cost of computing power dropped by orders of magnitude. Devices that had required entire rooms shrank to fit on desks, then into briefcases, then into pockets. The transition felt sudden because the world had spent so long in plateau. Businesses that had built their operations around paper and phone calls found themselves racing to digitize before competitors did. Banks installed ATM networks and connected them through dedicated lines, letting customers access accounts outside of banking hours for the first time. Airlines moved from paper tickets to electronic reservations, compressing the booking process from days to minutes. Retailers installed point-of-sale systems that tracked inventory automatically and transmitted sales data to central offices overnight. The transformation happened building by building, industry by industry, as organizations rewired themselves around the suddenly cheap logic of microprocessors. For people who had grown up in the mechanical era, the change carried a mixture of liberation and disorientation. Suddenly, information that had required trips to libraries could be accessed from home computers connected by modems to online services. Navigation systems appeared in cars, rendering paper maps obsolete almost overnight. Portable phones became common, then ubiquitous, transforming from expensive novelties to basic utilities. The rhythms of coordination changed as people could reach each other instantly instead of leaving messages and waiting for callbacks. The delay between question and answer compressed from days to seconds, which felt like magic at first and necessity soon after. The Internet, which had existed as a specialized network for researchers and government agencies, exploded into public consciousness. Unlike the gradual evolution it might have followed in another timeline, it arrived fully formed in technical terms but culturally raw. The first wave of users brought assumptions from a world of broadcast media, expecting authority and curation, and they collided with the architecture's inherent openness. Governments and corporations, which had controlled information flow through their ownership of transmission infrastructure, suddenly faced a network they couldn't easily manage. The early rules of online behavior emerged from conflict and experiment rather than from established norms, creating a culture that felt anarchic and creative, and sometimes chaotic. Entertainment distribution transformed within a decade. Physical media gave way to downloads and streaming, which meant that entire libraries of music and video could fit on devices small enough to carry anywhere. The economics of distribution collapsed towards zero, which destroyed the bottlenecks that had given record labels and studios their power. Artists could reach audiences directly, which democratized creation but also fragmented attention. The shared cultural moments that had defined broadcast television faded as everyone watched different things on their own schedules. Recommendation algorithms, crude at first but rapidly improving, began to curate personal entertainment streams, learning preferences and suggesting content in ways that felt helpful, and then subtly manipulating. Global supply chains reorganized around digital coordination. Container ships carried RFID tags that transmitted location and status constantly. Warehouses tracked inventory automatically, reordered supplies through algorithms that predicted demand, and routed shipments through optimized paths calculated in real time. Manufacturing became more dispersed as coordination costs fell, with components sourced from dozens of countries and assembled in factories that adjusted production based on order flow. The efficiency gains were enormous, but they came with brittleness. Systems optimized for just-in-time delivery had no slack, and disruptions propagated faster through tighter networks. Socially, the rapid digitization created generational divides sharper than the gradual transitions of the earlier timeline. People in their 20s adopted new technologies as native tools, building their social lives around messaging and online communities. People in their 50s had to learn systems that contradicted decades of habit, and many struggled or refused. The workplace became a site of friction, as younger workers expected instant communication and digital workflows while older managers maintained paper files and face-to-face meetings. Organizations that managed the transition well thrived. Those that couldn't failed. Privacy eroded quickly because the legal and cultural frameworks to protect it didn't exist yet. Companies gathered data about purchases, browsing, location and communication because they could, and because it was profitable, and most people didn't understand what they were giving away. The surveillance apparatus that had been impractical in the mechanical age became trivially easy with digital tools, and it grew in silence before anyone thought to regulate it. By the time activists and lawmakers began to push back, the infrastructure was entrenched and the business models depended on it. Education struggled with the disruption. Students who had grown up using digital tools expected constant access to information and became impatient with memorization and linear instruction. Teachers trained in the old methods had to reinvent pedagogy on the fly. The promise of personalized learning collided with the reality that screens were addictive and distracting. Schools debated whether to embrace devices or ban them, swinging between extremes as they tried to figure out what learning looked like when the internet was always present. By the mid-2000s, the world had caught up to and then surpassed the technological trajectory of the original timeline, compressed into a shorter span. The difference was the cultural memory of life before. Adults remembered when phones were attached to walls, when finding information required effort, when you had to arrange to meet people and then actually show up because there was no way to send a last-minute text. The contrast made the changes feel more dramatic, more like a rupture than an evolution. The sense of acceleration was real because it was recent. Looking back from the 2010s, it became clear that the delay had shaped not just what technology existed, but how societies related to it. Nations that had invested in mechanical infrastructure and analog systems found themselves with stranded assets that had to be abandoned or expensively retrofitted. Workers who had built careers around maintenance and operation of physical systems lost their relevance as software replaced their functions. Regions that had maintained their importance through geography found themselves bypassed as communication costs fell and location mattered less. The digital divide became not just about access to devices, but about the capacity to adapt institutional knowledge and cultural habits built over decades for a different kind of world. The political effects rippled outward. The centralization of digital platforms created new forms of power that didn't map onto the nation-state system that had evolved during the mechanical century. Social media companies headquartered in one country could shape political discourse in dozens of others. Cloud computing providers controlled infrastructure that governments depended on but couldn't fully regulate. The flow of information, which had once been constrained by the physics of paper and broadcasting, became a matter of algorithmic curation by private companies making decisions in private. Democratic systems built around assumptions of broadcast media struggled to adapt to environments where anyone could publish and where truth competed on equal terms with misinformation. Economically, the late arrival of cheap computing created boom and bust cycles compressed into shorter periods. Industries that had seemed stable, retail, publishing, travel booking, taxi services, collapsed within years as software-enabled competitors offered better prices and convenience. The creative destruction that might have occurred gradually over decades instead happened in waves that left entire workforces displaced. Retraining programs couldn't keep pace. Cities that had depended on industries disrupted by digitization faced fiscal crises. The wealth created by the digital economy concentrated in a handful of urban centers while the rest of the geography fell behind. In quieter ways, the texture of everyday life shifted toward abstraction. Navigation by algorithm replaced spatial knowledge, and people lost the ability to find their way without guidance. Photography became so cheap and easy that people stopped selecting moments carefully, shooting constantly and curating rarely. Communication became so frictionless that maintaining relationships required less effort and less commitment, which made them more numerous but thinner. The constant availability of distraction made boredom rarer, but sustained attention harder. The trade-offs weren't obvious at first, but they accumulated over years into a different way of being in the world. The older generation, who had grown up writing letters and making phone calls and showing up when they said they would, sometimes felt nostalgia for the mechanical century. They remembered when missing a call meant someone would call back later, when plans stayed fixed because you couldn't change them easily, when silence was normal and didn't need to be filled. The younger generation, who couldn't imagine life without instant access, thought of that world as one of unnecessary friction, inefficiency, and isolation. Both were right. The question wasn't which was better, but what had been traded and whether the exchange had been made consciously. By the 2020s, the memory of the mechanical world had started to fade even among those who had lived in it. The habits of digital life, checking phones constantly, expecting instant answers, navigating by GPS, consuming media in personalized streams, had become so normalized that it took effort to remember that other patterns were possible. Children born after the transition had no direct experience of a world without screens, without connectivity, without the assumption that all information was available immediately. The delay had compressed the generational shift into a single lifetime, making the contrast vivid, but also making the past seem more distant than it actually was. What the silicon delay revealed, in retrospect, was that the speed of modern life wasn't an inevitable consequence of human nature or progress itself. It was the result of specific technologies arriving at specific times and societies choosing to reorganize around them. The mechanical century moved at a different pace not because people were slower, but because the tools they used imposed different constraints and created different possibilities. Communication took longer, so patience was necessary. Information was scarce, so memory mattered more. Coordination required human interaction, so social skills stayed relevant. The world was less synchronized but more regional, less efficient but more resilient, less convenient but more tangible. The late arrival of silicon accelerated the transition so quickly that it felt like whiplash, but it also preserved a living memory of alternatives. People in the 2020s could still remember making decisions without consulting search engines, navigating without GPS, maintaining relationships through letters and occasional calls. They could remember the quiet of evenings without notifications, the focus possible when distraction wasn't always a tap away, the satisfaction of completing tasks without interruption. The mechanical world wasn't better or worse, just different, organized around scarcity of information and abundance of time rather than the inverse. The future remained uncertain in its particulars but clear in its direction. Computing power continued to cheapen, networks continued to densify, sensors continued to proliferate. The world was becoming more measured, more optimized, more responsive to data. Artificial intelligence, which had been held back by the same manufacturing constraints that delayed general computing, began to improve rapidly as training resources became available. The automation that had so far focused on routine tasks started to reach into judgment, creativity, and interaction, promising another wave of disruption. Looking at the path from the mechanical century through the digital acceleration toward whatever came next, the most striking thing was how contingent it all felt. Small differences in material science had delayed silicon by decades, which had kept societies on analog rails longer, which had shaped institutions and cultures in ways that persisted even after the technology arrived. The tools changed what was possible, but the speed at which societies adopted them was a choice, even if it often didn't feel like one. The rush to digitize everything, to connect everything, to optimize everything through software, that was driven by economic incentives and competitive pressures, but it wasn't foreordained. The silicon delay existed now only as memory and as a thought experiment, a way to understand what had been traded when the world accelerated. The mechanical century was gone, replaced by something faster and more fluid and more abstract. Whether that was progress or just change depended on what you valued and what you missed. The telephone operators in Minneapolis had mostly retired by now, and the building where they worked had been converted to apartments. The switchboards were long gone, replaced by fiber optic cables and routing algorithms that managed millions of calls simultaneously with no human intervention. The connections were better in every measurable way, clearer, faster, cheaper, more reliable, but they happened invisibly, automatically, without anyone needing to understand or tend them. That was the essence of what had changed. The world had become more capable but less visible, more efficient but less comprehensible, more convenient but less tangible. The mechanical systems that people could see and touch and repair had given way to software they could only use or accept. The delay had postponed that transition, but it hadn't prevented it. Once the technology became available, the economic logic of replacing human work with automated systems proved overwhelming. The question left behind was whether the speed at which it happened mattered, and what might have been different if there had been more time to adapt, to think through the consequences, to make conscious choices about what to preserve and what to abandon. The world of 2025 moved at the speed of silicon, which meant it moved faster than human reflex, faster than conversation, faster than deliberation. Information circulated constantly, attention fragmented continuously, change accelerated relentlessly. It was a world optimized for efficiency and novelty, uncomfortable with stillness and ambiguity. The mechanical century, with its slower rhythms and longer delays, had permitted a different relationship to time. Not better necessarily, but different enough that its absence left a space. People sometimes felt that space as a kind of emptiness, a sense that something had been lost in the acceleration, but they couldn't quite name what it was or imagine getting it back. The silicon delay in the end was just a story about timing and consequences, about what happens when a revolution arrives late and then all at once. It suggested that the modern world's velocity wasn't inevitable but contingent, the result of choices made and not made, of technologies that arrived when they did and shaped everything that came after. It raised the question of whether speed itself was something that could be chosen or rejected, or whether the logic of competition and efficiency made acceleration mandatory once the tools existed. And it left hanging in the air the possibility that other delays, other slowdowns, other pauses might yet arrive, giving future generations their own experiences of living between worlds, remembering one rhythm while adapting to another. The telecommunications industry, which had seemed so stable and permanent in the mechanical century, underwent the most visible transformation. The regional bell companies that had maintained vast networks of copper wire and mechanical switches found themselves suddenly obsolete, their infrastructure bypassed by digital systems that could route calls more efficiently and cheaply. The transition happened so quickly that thousands of technicians who had spent decades mastering the repair and maintenance of electromechanical systems found their expertise worthless. Retraining programs were announced, but the reality was that a 50-year-old specialist in crossbar switch maintenance couldn't easily become a software engineer. Some adapted, learning new skills and accepting entry-level positions in fields they didn't fully understand. Others took early retirement, accepting buyouts that seemed generous, until they realized they were being paid to disappear. Still others simply left the industry, taking whatever work they could find, carrying with them a quiet bitterness about the suddenness of the change. The cities themselves began to change in visible ways. Office buildings that had housed typing pools and filing departments found themselves with excess space as databases replaced paper records and email replaced inter-office memos. The square footage required per worker dropped as physical storage became unnecessary, and companies either consolidated into smaller footprints or subleased floors they no longer needed. The real estate market adjusted slowly, creating temporary gluts of commercial space in some cities. Older buildings with high ceilings and good light, originally designed for clerical work, became attractive to creative industries and tech startups that valued the aesthetics of the mechanical era even as they filled the spaces with the tools of the digital age. Banking transformed from a relationship business conducted in person to a transactional service accessed through screens. The neighborhood branches that had once been staffed by tellers who knew their customers' names and histories became automated vestibules with ATMs and video terminals connecting to call centers elsewhere. The personal knowledge that had guided lending decisions, understanding that this borrower was reliable even if his paperwork was messy, or that this business was seasonal and needed flexible terms, got replaced by credit scoring algorithms that evaluated applications based on statistical patterns. The algorithms were more consistent and less biased in some ways, but they also eliminated the space for human judgment and local context. Someone who had fallen on hard times but had a plan to recover might have gotten help from a banker who knew them. The algorithm only saw the numbers and declined the application. Newspapers, which had survived as local institutions through the mechanical century, began their slow collapse. The classified advertising that had provided a substantial portion of revenue migrated to websites that could reach wider audiences at lower cost. Craigslist and its successors didn't need printing presses, delivery trucks, or unionized labor. They needed servers and bandwidth, which cost a fraction of what physical distribution required. News gathering, which had been an expensive operation requiring reporters, editors, photographers, and extensive administrative support, couldn't compete with free content aggregated from multiple sources. Papers tried to adapt by launching websites, but they couldn't figure out how to charge for content when readers expected information to be free. Advertising revenue followed audiences online, but it fragmented among thousands of sites instead of concentrating in a few dominant papers. The industry went through waves of layoffs, mergers, and closures. Cities that had supported multiple daily papers ended up with one struggling publication, or none at all, relying instead on a chaotic mixture of local blogs, national websites, and social media for their news. The music industry experienced its transformation as a cautionary tale that other industries watched with alarm. The shift from physical to digital distribution happened so fast that the major labels couldn't adapt their business models in time. File-sharing networks, enabled by the sudden availability of cheap bandwidth and storage, allowed people to build music collections without paying anything. The industry's initial response was to sue individual users, which generated publicity but didn't stop the behavior. By the time legitimate digital stores appeared offering legal downloads at reasonable prices, a generation had grown accustomed to free music and saw payment as optional. Artists found themselves in a strange position. They could reach global audiences without label support, but making a living from recorded music became nearly impossible because the per-stream payments were fractional pennies. Revenue shifted to live performance and merchandise, which meant that musicians had to tour constantly to earn enough to continue making music. The democratization of distribution created a long tail of artists with small audiences, but it also made it harder for anyone to build a sustainable career. Education faced its own crisis of adaptation. Universities that had built their prestige on controlling access to knowledge and credentialing suddenly found themselves competing with free online courses that offered similar content. The initial response was defensive, pointing out that online courses lacked the social experience of campus life, the mentorship of faculty, the signal value of a prestigious degree. All of that was true, but it didn't address the underlying challenge that the cost of higher education had been rising faster than inflation for decades, while the value proposition was becoming less clear. Students began to question whether 4 years and 6 figures of debt were worth it when the knowledge could be acquired elsewhere, and the job market was increasingly credentializing based on demonstrated skills rather than degrees. Universities responded with online programs of their own, but they struggled to reconcile the high-touch, expensive model of residential education with the low-cost expectations of digital delivery. Some institutions adapted by focusing on what couldn't be replicated online: laboratory work, creative studios, professional networks, while others tried to compete on price and convenience. The stratification increased, with elite institutions maintaining their position, while regional schools faced declining enrollment and financial pressure. Healthcare experienced technological transformation without the cost reductions that characterized other industries. Medical records moved from paper files to electronic systems, which improved coordination between providers but required enormous investments in software and training. The interoperability problems were severe. Different hospital systems used incompatible software that couldn't easily share information, which meant that the promised benefits of digitization arrived slowly and incompletely. Telemedicine became possible, allowing patients in rural areas to consult with specialists remotely, but reimbursement policies lagged behind the technology, making it difficult for providers to get paid for virtual visits. Diagnostic tools improved dramatically as image processing algorithms could detect patterns that human observers might miss, but the liability questions around algorithmic decision-making remained murky. The overall effect was to increase the complexity and cost of healthcare delivery, while making some specific aspects more efficient. Patients found themselves navigating Byzantine insurance websites, dealing with billing systems that generated incomprehensible statements, and struggling to understand who was responsible when something went wrong in the handoffs between digital systems. Manufacturing automation accelerated as cheap computing made it economically viable to replace human workers with robots and numerical control systems in more contexts. The previous generation of industrial automation had focused on tasks that were repetitive, dangerous, or required precision beyond human capability. The new wave of automation, enabled by better sensors and more sophisticated software, could handle tasks that required adaptation and judgment, picking irregularly shaped objects, adjusting to variations in materials, coordinating complex assembly sequences. Factories that had employed hundreds of workers on assembly lines reduced their workforce to dozens of technicians maintaining the machines. The productivity gains were substantial, but they flowed to capital rather than labor. The jobs that disappeared had been stable middle-class employment. The jobs that replaced them required either advanced technical skills or paid minimum wage for tasks that couldn't yet be automated. The geographic effects were concentrated in regions where manufacturing had been the primary employer, creating pockets of persistent unemployment and social dysfunction. Retail underwent its own painful transformation as e-commerce sites could offer wider selection, lower prices, and greater convenience than physical stores. The big box retailers that had dominated the landscape in the mechanical century found themselves squeezed between online giants that could undercut their prices and local specialists who offered expertise and curation. Shopping malls, which had been social centres as well as commercial spaces, began to empty as anchor stores closed and foot traffic declined. Some malls were repurposed into mixed-use developments with apartments, offices and entertainment venues. Others were simply abandoned, leaving behind empty parking lots and boarded-up storefronts. Small-town main streets suffered similarly, unable to compete with the selection and pricing available online. The consumer experience became more convenient but more isolated, shifting from social activity to solitary transaction. The knowledge that local shopkeepers had provided, recommendations based on knowing your taste, suggestions for gifts, expertise about products, disappeared in favour of algorithmic recommendations based on purchase history and demographic profiles. The legal system struggled to adapt to the speed and complexity of digital life. Laws written for a world of physical documents and face-to-face transactions didn't map cleanly onto digital equivalents. Questions about intellectual property, privacy, liability and jurisdiction all became more complicated. Courts moved slowly because that's how legal systems were designed to work, with time for briefs, arguments, deliberation. But the technologies they were regulating evolved faster than case law could develop. Legislatures weren't much better. By the time a bill addressing some aspect of digital technology could be drafted, debated, and passed, the technology had often changed enough to make the law partially obsolete. The result was a regulatory environment that felt arbitrary and inconsistent, with significant gaps where behaviour went unregulated and other areas where rules contradicted each other. International relations took on new dimensions as cyber capabilities became tools of statecraft. The mechanical century had limited espionage and sabotage to physical acts, stealing documents, recruiting agents, bombing facilities, which required significant resources and carried clear risks. Digital operations could be conducted at a distance, with plausible deniability, at scale and low cost. Nation-states developed capabilities to penetrate each other's networks, steal intellectual property, and potentially disrupt critical infrastructure. The boundaries between espionage, crime, and warfare blurred in cyberspace in ways that existing international law didn't address. Attribution remained difficult. An attack could be routed through servers in multiple countries, making it hard to determine who was responsible. The doctrine of deterrence that had stabilized the nuclear standoff in the mechanical century didn't translate well to cyber conflict, where the threshold for action was lower and the consequences less catastrophic but more frequent. Social movements and political organizing transformed as activists gained tools for coordination and mobilization that didn't depend on traditional media or institutional support. Flash mobs and protest movements could organize in hours rather than weeks, using social media to spread information and coordinate action. The speed enabled rapid response to events, but it also made movements volatile and leaderless in ways that made them hard to sustain or channel into concrete policy changes. The Arab Spring, the Occupy movement, and various other uprisings demonstrated both the power and the limitations of digitally coordinated activism. Large numbers of people could be brought together quickly, but without the institutional structure that traditional organizing had built, formal organizations, elected leadership, clear demands, the movements tended to dissipate as quickly as they formed. Dating and social relationships moved online in ways that changed their fundamental character. Meeting people had traditionally happened through shared physical spaces, school, work, religious institutions, social events, which meant that relationships formed within existing networks and carried social context. Online dating removed those constraints, making it possible to meet people outside your normal circles, but it also transformed the initial connection into a process of sorting through profiles and exchanging messages with strangers. The abundance of potential partners paradoxically made commitment harder. There was always another profile to swipe, another possibility to explore. The reduction of people to profiles, a handful of photos and a short bio, encouraged quick judgments based on superficial criteria and made it easier to discard potential matches for trivial reasons. Some people thrived in this environment, enjoying the expanded options and the efficiency of screening. Others found it exhausting and dehumanizing, missing the organic way relationships had developed through repeated casual interactions in shared spaces. The gig economy emerged as a hybrid between traditional employment and independent contracting, enabled by platforms that could efficiently match workers with short-term tasks. Driving for ride-sharing services, delivering food, performing microtasks online. All of these created income opportunities for people who needed flexible work, but they also fragmented stable employment into precarious piece-rate labor without benefits or security. The platforms argued they were simply connecting willing buyers and sellers, providing technology infrastructure rather than acting as employers. Workers often found themselves trapped in a grey zone, dependent on the platforms for income but lacking the protections and benefits of employment. The flexibility cut both ways. Workers could choose their hours, but they also bore all the risk of variable demand, vehicle maintenance, and lack of steady income. Addiction patterns shifted toward digital stimuli, as variable reward schedules built into apps and games proved more engaging than many physical world alternatives. Social media platforms optimized for engagement, which meant designing systems that kept users checking constantly for notifications, likes, and updates. Gaming companies refined techniques for maintaining player attention and encouraging in-game purchases. The dopamine loops that made these systems compelling weren't accidents. They were deliberate design choices based on behavioral psychology research. The effects on attention span, sleep patterns, and mental health became apparent in population-level studies, but individual experiences varied widely. Some people used digital tools productively and maintained healthy boundaries. Others found themselves compulsively checking their phones, feeling anxious when separated from devices, organizing their lives around digital feedback. The environmental consequences of digitization proved mixed and complex. On one hand, dematerialization reduced some forms of consumption. Less paper, less travel, more efficient logistics. On the other hand, the energy requirements of data centers, the rare earth minerals needed for electronics, and the e-waste generated by rapid device obsolescence created new environmental burdens. The mining operations that extracted lithium, cobalt, and other materials for batteries and electronics often devastated local environments and exploited workers in countries with weak regulations. The data centers that powered cloud computing required enormous amounts of electricity for servers and cooling, enough that their aggregate consumption became a significant fraction of total energy use. The short product life cycles encouraged by fashion and planned obsolescence meant that devices were discarded while still functional, creating waste streams that were difficult to recycle because of the complexity of modern electronics. Inequality widened as the returns to capital and specialized skills increased, while routine labor became less valuable. The software developers, financiers, and entrepreneurs who could leverage digital tools to reach global markets accumulated wealth at unprecedented rates. Workers whose jobs could be automated or outsourced faced stagnant or declining wages. The geographic concentration of high-paying jobs in a few urban centers created regional disparities that reinforced themselves through agglomeration effects. Talent attracted more talent, which attracted capital, which attracted more talent. Housing costs in successful cities rose beyond what typical workers could afford, pricing out the teachers, service workers, and public employees necessary to make cities function. The political consequences manifested in populist backlash against globalization and technology, with voters in declining regions supporting candidates who promised to restore the economic arrangements of the mechanical century. Epistemology itself became contested as digital media undermined the authority of traditional gatekeepers. In the mechanical century, information had flowed through institutions, newspapers, broadcasters, publishers, that had reputations to maintain and professional standards to uphold. The barriers to publication meant that most of what circulated had been filtered by editors, fact-checkers, and peer reviewers. Digital platforms removed those barriers, which was democratizing, but also meant that accurate information and misinformation circulated on equal terms. The algorithms that determined what people saw optimized for engagement rather than accuracy, which often meant promoting content that was surprising, outrageous, or emotionally resonant regardless of its truthfulness. Conspiracy theories and pseudoscience found audiences they never could have reached in the mechanical era. The fragmentation of information sources meant that people increasingly inhabited separate epistemic universes, encountering different facts and operating under different assumptions about what was true. Trust in institutions declined as digital tools made it easier to document and publicize institutional failures while making it harder to maintain the mystique that had previously surrounded authorities. Police misconduct caught on video, corporate malfeasance revealed in leaked documents, political hypocrisy exposed through archived social media posts. All of these eroded the deference that had characterized the mechanical century. The institutions often deserved the scrutiny, having relied on opacity to maintain authority they hadn't always earned. But the relentless exposure also made it difficult for any institution to maintain legitimacy, creating a crisis of confidence in collective institutions generally. The result was a society that was more transparent but also more cynical, more informed about flaws but less capable of collective action. The arts struggled with digitization in ways that were both liberating and destructive. The costs of creation and distribution fell dramatically, making it possible for anyone with a computer to produce and share music, video, writing, and visual art. The gatekeepers who had controlled access to audiences lost their monopoly, which expanded the range of voices and styles that could find audiences. But the economic model that had supported professional artists collapsed. The abundance of free content made it nearly impossible to charge for creative work, and the attention economy meant that even reaching an audience required constant self-promotion and platform manipulation. Artists found themselves spending more time on marketing and less on creation, or accepting that their art was a hobby rather than a career. The cultural output became broader but thinner, with more diversity but less depth, more experiment but less polish. Memory itself changed character as digital archives made perfect recall possible, but also optional. In the mechanical century, remembering was necessary because information couldn't be easily retrieved. People developed elaborate internal systems for organizing knowledge, and education focused partly on strengthening memory. Digital tools made memory less necessary. You could always look things up. The change freed cognitive resources for other tasks, but it also made people more dependent on external systems. When those systems were unavailable, no phone, no connection, no power, people found themselves helpless in ways that would have seemed strange to their parents. The collective memory also became more perfect and more accessible, which had complex effects. Historical events could be researched in detail, primary sources examined directly, but the permanent record also meant that youthful indiscretions never fully faded, that context collapsed, and past statements could be weaponized regardless of how much time had passed or how much people had changed. The pace of life accelerated in ways that were difficult to resist individually even when collectively recognized as problematic. Email created an expectation of rapid response that bled into evenings and weekends, making it hard to disconnect from work. The always-on nature of digital communication meant that the boundaries between professional and personal time became porous and had to be actively defended. The constant availability of distraction made sustained focus harder to maintain. The habit of checking phones every few minutes became so ingrained that people did it unconsciously. The long-form thinking that the mechanical century had encouraged, reading books, following complex arguments, working through problems systematically, competed with the rapid-fire stimulation of digital media. Some people adapted by developing new practices of deliberate disconnection, setting boundaries around device use, creating spaces for sustained attention. Others found themselves perpetually distracted, skimming surfaces without going deep, feeling busy but not productive. Children growing up in the digitally accelerated world developed different cognitive patterns than their parents. They were native to environments of constant stimulation and rapid task switching, comfortable with parallel processing and partial attention in ways that looked like distraction to older generations. The educational system struggled to engage them using methods designed for a slower, more focused mode of learning. Teachers experimented with incorporating digital tools into classrooms, but often found that devices became sources of distraction rather than aids to learning. The deeper question, whether the cognitive patterns encouraged by digital environments were adaptive or maladaptive, remained unresolved. Perhaps this was simply what human cognition looked like when technology changed faster than biology, and the next generation would develop still different patterns adapted to whatever came next. The geopolitical consequences of the late but rapid digital transition created new forms of competition and cooperation. Nations that had dominated the mechanical century found their advantages eroded as digital infrastructure could be built quickly and didn't depend on accumulated industrial capital. Countries that had been peripheral in manufacturing became central in services that could be delivered digitally. English language skills became more valuable as the internet developed primarily in English, giving advantages to nations with English-speaking populations or strong English education. The concentration of platform companies in the United States gave it soft power through the architecture of digital communication, but also created vulnerabilities as other nations sought to build alternative systems or regulate American companies operating in their territories. China developed its own digital ecosystem behind regulatory barriers, creating a parallel internet that served a fifth of humanity but remained separate from the global network. The fragmentation that had seemed impossible in the early optimistic days of the internet became reality as nations asserted sovereignty over digital spaces. The speed of change left people disoriented in ways that were hard to articulate. It wasn't just that technology was different, it was that the rate of change meant nothing could be taken for granted. Skills that had been valuable became obsolete within years. Industries that had seemed permanent vanished. Ways of doing things that had worked for generations stopped working. The constant adaptation required was exhausting for many people, particularly those in middle age who had built their lives around assumptions that no longer held. Younger people, who had grown up with constant change, seemed more comfortable with impermanence, but also more anxious, uncertain about whether any foundation they built would remain stable. The collective sense of acceleration created a present-focused culture where long-term planning seemed pointless because the future was too uncertain to predict. Looking at the full arc from the mechanical century through the digital acceleration toward an increasingly automated future, the contingency of it all became clear. The delay hadn't prevented the transformation, it had only compressed it into a shorter time span, making the contrast starker and the adaptation more jarring. The world that emerged was in some ways more free, more options, more information, more connection, but also more precarious, more unequal, more exhausting. The trade-offs were real and the losses genuine, even as the gains were also real and transformative. The question that lingered was whether the speed itself had cost something, whether having more time to adapt, to build social and legal structures around new technologies, to make conscious choices about what to preserve, would have produced a more stable, more equitable, more livable outcome. The experiment had been run one way. The counterfactual remained unknowable. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The Atlantic is always described as a bridge, but on certain nights in autumn when the rain falls softly and the lamplight catches the wet pavement in European port cities, it is easier to imagine it as a door. Not a door that slams, but one that closes so gradually that no single person notices the moment when it finally shuts. This is the story of such a closing, a generation when the ocean stopped being a highway and became, once again, a boundary. The break did not announce itself with sirens or declarations. There was no single catastrophe that historians could later point to and say, that was when it began. Instead, it accumulated. A cargo vessel lost off the mid-Atlantic ridge in March, another in June, insurance premiums climbing week by week. A passenger liner delayed indefinitely in Southampton, while underwriters argued over liability clauses that no longer matched the risk. Port authorities in New York and Hamburg began requiring additional inspections, then double inspections, then inspections so thorough that ships sat idle for days waiting for clearance. The costs mounted, the schedules fractured, and slowly, imperceptibly at first, the Atlantic crossing transformed from routine to gamble. By the time officials convened to address the crisis, the patterns were already hardening. The initial discussions focused on restoring confidence, better convoy systems, improved tracking, new maritime treaties. But each proposed solution required coordination across an ocean that was already becoming difficult to cross reliably. Meetings were postponed when delegates couldn't secure passage. Emergency communications bounced between continents with days of delay. The very infrastructure needed to solve the problem depended on the infrastructure that was failing. And so the conversations grew longer, the disagreements deeper, and the solutions more distant, while ship owners made their own calculations and found that domestic routes offered better margins with less exposure. The self-reinforcing nature of the collapse became clear within 18 months. Fewer crossings meant fewer trained crews with Atlantic experience. Fewer arrivals meant port facilities scaled back their specialized equipment. Fewer reliable schedules meant cargo shippers stopped planning around transatlantic routes and built their supply chains closer to home. Banks stopped financing oceanic ventures with the same terms they offered for continental trade. The maritime insurance market, already strained, began declining to cover certain categories of crossing entirely. What had been the world's busiest ocean highway slowly became a route that only the most essential, most guarded, most expensive shipments justified. Distance, which had seemed to shrink steadily for a century, expanded again. Not in miles, the ocean remained exactly as wide as it had always been, but in time, cost and psychological weight. The crossing that had once been an inconvenience became a significant undertaking. The business trip that could be scheduled casually now required months of planning and acceptance of substantial risk. The family visit that might have been an annual tradition became something contemplated once in a lifetime. The ocean reasserted itself not through storms or monsters, but through simple, grinding unreliability. In London, the shipping offices along the Thames that had once hummed with constant activity grew quieter. Clerks who had managed intricate webs of transatlantic cargo schedules found their work simplified to coastal routes and continental destinations. The great passenger terminals saw their waiting rooms emptied, their customs halls echoing. Ships that had been built specifically for the Atlantic crossing were refitted for shorter voyages, or, when that proved uneconomical, were simply moored and left to rust in distant harbours, where the cost of salvage exceeded their remaining value. Across the ocean, similar scenes played out in reverse. The piers of New York, once crowded with arrivals and departures, saw their traffic redirect toward coastal cities and southward to the Caribbean and South America. The customs agents who had processed endless streams of European goods and travellers found themselves reassigned to other borders or to other departments entirely. The translators, the currency exchangers, the specialised brokers who had facilitated transatlantic commerce, all found their expertise suddenly less valuable than it had been. The economic reorientation happened first in the industries most dependent on regular high-volume exchange. Manufacturers who had relied on specific materials from across the Atlantic began searching for alternatives. A textile mill in Manchester that had imported American cotton as its primary input spent 2 years retooling to work with Egyptian and Indian supplies, changing not just its sourcing but its entire production process to accommodate different fibre qualities. A steelworks in Pennsylvania that had depended on Swedish ore invested heavily in expanding domestic mining operations, even though the quality and cost were less favourable. These were not simple substitutions. Each represented a fundamental reorganisation of production, employment, expertise, and capital. The financial sector responded to the disruption with characteristic speed, but without characteristic confidence. Banks that had specialised in transatlantic trade credit found their business models obsolete almost overnight. Some tried to pivot toward domestic lending, but they competed poorly against established local institutions that better understood regional risks and opportunities. Others simply contracted, laying off staff and reducing their ambitions to match the new reality. The stock exchanges, so recently integrated through telegraph into a synchronized Atlantic financial system, began to drift apart in their rhythms and priorities. News that once moved instantly now arrived, with delay and uncertainty, and traders learned to rely more heavily on local information and less on coordination with distant markets. But the economic shift was not simply about loss and contraction. New patterns emerged. Europe, unable to rely on American grain and materials with the old certainty, invested aggressively in agricultural intensification and resource development within the continent and in closer colonies. The farm machinery industry boomed in Germany and France. Chemical fertilizers, previously a specialty product, became standard across European agriculture. Forests that had been preserved were now harvested to provide timber that could no longer be easily imported. Mines opened in regions that would have been considered marginal when cheaper supplies could flow freely across the Atlantic. In the Americas, the disruption forced a different kind of reorganization. With European markets less accessible, manufacturers looked south and west. The trade networks that had been secondary to the Atlantic routes, the coastal shipping between American ports, the railways linking North and South America, the river commerce through the continent's interior, suddenly became primary. Cities like Buenos Aires and São Paulo, which had been growing steadily but remained somewhat peripheral to the Atlantic economy, found themselves at the centre of new regional networks. investment flowed toward infrastructure that connected the Americas internally, rather than externally. Railways were built not to reach port cities for transatlantic export, but to link production centers with regional markets. The change in economic geography brought changes in economic culture. Prosperity had been measured for generations by connection to the broader Atlantic world. Cities boasted of their steamship lines, their telegraph connections, their cosmopolitan character born of constant exchange. Now prosperity began to be measured differently, by self-sufficiency, by regional integration, by the ability to produce locally what had once been imported. The vocabulary of business shifted. Global reach gave way to regional resilience. International standards became continental preferences. The very definition of success transformed from participation in a unified Atlantic economy to mastery of a more localized domain. Major cities rose or fell based on their position in these new networks. Liverpool, which had been England's window to America, found its purpose diminished and its population drifting toward London and the industrial Midlands, where continental trade offered more reliable opportunities. Hamburg's focus shifted eastward, deeper into Central Europe. New York remained enormous and wealthy, but its character changed, less a gateway to Europe, more a capital of American continental commerce. Boston, so long oriented toward transatlantic connections, struggled more than New York, its economy too specialized in the old patterns. Meanwhile, cities, like Chicago and Toronto, already oriented toward internal North American networks, found their importance enhanced. The geopolitical consequences took longer to manifest but proved equally profound. The Atlantic Alliance system, built on assumptions of rapid communication and reliable movement of troops and material, began to feel increasingly theoretical. When crises emerged, and they always emerged, the mechanisms of coordination that had been merely cumbersome became nearly impossible. A border dispute in Central Europe that might once have been refereed through a conference involving American observers now proceeded without such mediation. A trade disagreement in South America that might have involved European arbitration now was settled through regional negotiation, or simply left unresolved. Military planning adjusted to the new constraints. The American Navy, which had been expanding its Atlantic fleet with an eye toward projecting power in European waters, reoriented toward Pacific and Caribbean priorities. European powers, which had contemplated transatlantic cooperation as a check on regional competitors, returned to purely continental calculations. The strategic planning documents began to reflect a world where the Atlantic was no longer a shared operational space, but a boundary between distinct spheres of influence. The effect was not immediate war, or even immediate hostility, but rather a gradual cooling of relationships that had been forged in an era of closer connection. Diplomats still communicated, but through cables and letters rather than face-to-face meetings. Treaties were still negotiated, but with longer delays and more misunderstandings born of context that could not be easily conveyed at a distance. Trust, that delicate commodity that requires constant reinforcement through personal contact and shared experience, began to erode. The erosion showed itself in small ways before becoming a larger pattern. Military attachés who had been stationed in foreign capitals to build understanding between forces were recalled or simply not replaced when their terms ended. Joint training exercises that had been scheduled became too complicated to coordinate. Intelligence sharing, never entirely free, became more guarded as each side worried that information given today might be used against them tomorrow if relations deteriorated further. The caution was self-fulfilling. As cooperation decreased, so did the mutual dependence that had made cooperation seem worthwhile. Alliances that might have formed quickly in an earlier era now took years to negotiate, and even then remained fragile. Without the ability to station troops or move supplies reliably across the Atlantic, mutual defense pacts felt less like concrete commitments and more like vague promises. A European power threatened by a neighbor could not count on American reinforcements arriving in time to matter. An American interest challenged in the Western Hemisphere could not assume European naval support would be available. Each side developed contingency plans that assumed they would face their challenges alone, and those assumptions shaped procurement, training, and doctrine in ways that made future cooperation even more difficult. The development of distinct military doctrines on each side of the Atlantic reflected these diverging realities. European powers, facing each other across land borders, invested in mass conscription armies, extensive railway networks for rapid mobilization, and defensive fortifications designed to buy time for Allies to assemble. American military thinking, focused on hemispheric defense and Pacific interests, emphasized naval power, coastal fortifications, and the ability to project force over long distances within the Americas, but with less concern for European entanglements. The two military cultures, once in constant conversation, began to speak different languages and to see different threats. The psychological dimension of this separation was subtle but pervasive. Security for a generation before the break had been conceived as a transatlantic problem, requiring transatlantic solutions. Now it became a series of regional problems requiring regional solutions. The very idea of the West as a unified geopolitical entity began to fragment. European intellectuals spoke of Western civilization, but increasingly meant European civilization, with America becoming an offshoot that had gone its own way. American thinkers adopted similar language in reverse, positioning their continent as the true inheritor of Western principles, while Europe descended into its old habits of rivalry and war. This mutual othering was not driven by hostility so much as by the simple need to make sense of separation. When allies cannot be relied upon, it is psychologically easier to redefine them as not quite allies, as different in fundamental ways that explain and justify the distance. The narratives that emerged on each side of the Atlantic increasingly emphasized divergence rather than commonality, distinctiveness rather than shared heritage. These were not deliberate propaganda campaigns, though governments sometimes encouraged such thinking. More often, they were organic responses to changed circumstances, as people constructed identities that matched their actual experiences rather than aspirational visions of unity. The human dimension of the break was perhaps most painful in the realm of migration and family connection. The great wave of migration that had linked European and American populations for generations did not stop instantly, but it slowed dramatically. Where once hundreds of thousands made the crossing each year, fleeing poverty or persecution, seeking opportunity or adventure, now only tens of thousands attempted it, and many of those turned back when faced with the delays, costs, and uncertainties. The communities most affected were those still in the process of formation, still deeply connected across the Atlantic through recent immigration. Irish neighbourhoods in Boston that had been constantly refreshed with new arrivals from County Cork and County Mayo saw that flow reduced to a trickle. Italian districts in New York that had been built by and for immigrants from Calabria and Sicily became more settled, less dynamic, more thoroughly American in their character. German communities in the Midwest that had maintained close ties to the old country found those connections attenuating, the letters arriving less frequently, the visits becoming impossible to arrange. For individuals caught between two worlds, the break meant impossible choices. A man who had planned to spend 10 years in America building savings before returning to bring his family over found that plan suddenly obsolete. Either bring them now, at great expense and risk, or accept that the reunion might never happen. A woman who had left parents in Europe with promises of regular visits found those promises unkept, the guilt accumulating with each passing year that contact remained only through letters that took weeks to arrive and often seemed inadequate to convey what needed saying. The children of immigrants, the second generation, experienced the break differently. For them, the old country had always been somewhat abstract. Stories told by parents, traditions maintained in immigrant communities, identities claimed but not deeply felt. The break made these connections even more tenuous. Without the regular arrival of new immigrants to reinforce ethnic identities and cultural practices, assimilation accelerated. Language retention declined more rapidly. Traditional customs were maintained more as performance than as lived experience. The hyphenated identities, Irish American, German American, Italian American, began to emphasize the second half more than the first. This shift was not universal or uniform. Some communities worked deliberately to preserve connections across the Atlantic despite the obstacles. Churches maintained correspondence with their mother institutions. Cultural societies organized to keep traditions alive. Newspapers in immigrant languages continued to publish, though with less news from the homeland and more focus on local community matters. But these were efforts swimming against a powerful current, and they could slow but not stop the process of separation. Cities changed their character as migration slowed. The neighborhoods that had been in constant flux, with new arrivals moving in as earlier immigrants moved up and out, became more stable. This stability brought some benefits. Stronger local institutions, more political power as communities became established voting blocs, better relations with surrounding neighborhoods as suspicion of foreigners decreased. But it also brought loss, less linguistic diversity, less cultural innovation born of mixing, less sense of connection to a wider world. The European side experienced these changes differently but no less profoundly. The safety valve of migration, which had allowed tens of thousands to leave each year in search of better lives, was suddenly less available. Young men who might have tried their luck in America now had to make their futures at home. This increased competition for jobs and land, adding to social pressures that were already substantial. In some countries, governments responded by encouraging internal migration or settlement in colonies, trying to redirect the energy and ambition that had previously flowed across the Atlantic. The demographic effects rippled outward in unexpected ways. America, with migration sharply reduced, saw birth rates take on greater importance in shaping its ethnic composition. The population became more native-born, more rooted, less polyglot. Europe, retaining populations that might have emigrated, faced different challenges: how to provide opportunities for young people, how to integrate regions with different levels of development, how to manage the political tensions that came when economic pressure could not be released through emigration. The cultural consequences of separation emerged gradually but grew increasingly evident as the years passed. The Atlantic had been, for the previous century, not just a route for goods and people, but a medium for cultural exchange. Music, literature, fashion, ideas, all had flowed back and forth, creating a shared cultural space despite the geographic distance. Now that flow slowed to a trickle, and the cultures on each side began to evolve along divergent paths. The initial phase felt like disruption more than divergence. American publishers who had routinely imported European books found their supply chains broken and turned to domestic authors to fill the gap. European magazines that had featured American writers found it harder to secure new material and focused more on local talent. Concert tours that had regularly crossed the Atlantic became rare events rather than routine occurrences. Theatre companies that had performed in both London and New York chose one or the other, but rarely both. The immediate effect was not that culture stopped crossing the ocean. It was that the crossing became slower, more selective, more expensive. But over time, this selectivity changed the nature of what crossed. Cultural exchange became less about the organic flow of everyday creativity and more about curated presentations of prestigious works. When an American book made it to European readers, it was more likely to be one that had already achieved substantial success at home, selected by publishers as a safe bet rather than a discovery of new talent. When European music reached American audiences, it came as a preserved recording or a carefully marketed tour, not as the informal exchange of musicians moving freely between scenes. Each side saw the other's culture through an increasingly narrow lens. This narrowing of exchange created space for mythology. America, in the European imagination, began to take on exaggerated qualities. Some saw it as a land of crude vitality, all energy and no refinement, a place where culture was thin and commerce was king. Others romanticized it as a place of freedom and innovation, unbound by Europe's traditions and class structures. Both views contained elements of truth and elements of fantasy. But with fewer people actually experiencing America firsthand, the fantasies faced less correction from reality. Europeans, in the American imagination, underwent a similar transformation into symbol. Some Americans saw Europe as decadent and exhausted, mired in old conflicts and unable to embrace the modern world. Others idealized it as the keeper of authentic culture and civilization, a place of art and learning that America could never match. Again, reality was more complex than either view allowed, but reality was less accessible than it had been, and symbols filled the gap. The practical effect was that culture became less of a conversation, and more of a series of pronouncements. American jazz, when it reached Europe in recordings, was interpreted through European frameworks rather than understood in its American context. European artistic movements, when they influenced American artists, were often misunderstood or adapted in ways that would have surprised their originators. This was not entirely new. Cultural borrowing always involves transformation, but the pace of feedback slowed and the distortions compounded. Fashion provides a revealing example. In the previous era, styles had moved rapidly between Paris and New York, with wealthy women on both sides of the Atlantic eager to wear the latest designs and designers travelling freely between capitals to understand both markets. Now, with travel rare and expensive, fashion began to split into distinct Atlantic styles. European design, influenced by available materials and local preferences, moved in certain directions. American fashion, shaped by different constraints and different cultural values, moved in others. When the styles did cross over, they came as exotic imports rather than as part of a unified fashion system. Literature diverged perhaps most profoundly because it relied so heavily on shared context and language that was constantly being refreshed through exchange. American English and British English had always had differences, but constant contact had kept them mutually intelligible and mutually influential. Now the differences began to widen. New slang emerged independently on each side. Publishing conventions diverged. Literary movements developed in response to local conditions without the constant cross-pollination that had previously occurred. A novel written in America increasingly needed cultural translation to be understood in Britain, and vice versa. The film industry, still in its early development when the break began, evolved along parallel but distinct paths. Hollywood, already emerging as America's film capital, developed without the European competition and European artistic influence that might have shaped it differently. European film industries, particularly those in France and Britain and Germany, developed their own approaches without the same degree of American commercial pressure. When films did cross the Atlantic, which they occasionally did as film prints were easier to transport than live performers, they often seemed strange to audiences, reflecting different aesthetic values and different assumptions about what cinema should be. Music recorded on different continents began to sound different, not just in genre, but in technical approach. American recording studios developed certain techniques and preferences. European studios developed others. Jazz evolved in America without the same degree of European influence that might have shaped it, had transatlantic exchange remained constant. European classical music continued its development, but with less awareness of American innovations in popular music that might have influenced it. The result, after a generation, was two musical landscapes that shared some common heritage but were increasingly distinct in their contemporary expressions. The infrastructure of cultural exchange itself transformed. The publishing houses that had maintained offices on both sides of the Atlantic closed some operations or reorganized to focus on single continents. The concert agencies that had specialized in booking transatlantic tours shifted to more reliable regional circuits. The art galleries that had regularly exhibited European works in America or American works in Europe reduced such exhibitions to rare events. The institutions that had facilitated cultural connection either adapted to the new reality or disappeared. In their place, new institutions emerged that reflected the separation. Cultural societies were formed explicitly to preserve knowledge of the other side. The American Society for European Culture, the European Association for American Studies, acknowledging by their very existence that such knowledge could no longer be taken for granted. These organizations collected books and records and photographs, organized lectures by the rare travelers who still made the crossing, and tried to maintain awareness of cultural developments across the ocean. But they were fighting against the natural tendency of attention to focus on what was immediate and accessible. Education changed to reflect the new cultural geography. Schools in America began teaching less European history and more American and hemispheric history. European schools reduced their coverage of American topics. Language instruction shifted focus. In America, Spanish became more important than French or German, as hemispheric connections grew more relevant than European ones. In Europe, English instruction continued but increasingly focused on British English rather than including American variations. The curriculum changes both reflected and reinforced the growing cultural separation. The technological trajectories of the two sides of the Atlantic began to diverge in ways that would have seemed unlikely before the break. Innovation had previously been a transatlantic conversation, with engineers and inventors on both sides aware of each other's work and building on each other's advances. Now that conversation became intermittent and incomplete. European engineers working on a problem might develop a solution unaware that American engineers had already solved it differently, or vice versa. The result was not that progress stopped, but that it forked. Railway development provides a clear example. Both continents invested heavily in expanding and improving their rail networks, but they did so in response to different needs and with different constraints. European railways, serving densely populated areas with moderate distances between cities, focused on speed and frequency. American railways, crossing vast spaces between population centers, emphasized capacity and efficiency. These different priorities led to different technical standards, different gauges, different signaling systems, different approaches to locomotive design. In an earlier era, international conferences would have worked to harmonize these standards. Now each continent developed its own, and the standards became more incompatible with each passing year. Electrical systems underwent similar divergence. As electrification spread, in cities first, then gradually into more rural areas, decisions made about voltage, frequency, and plug design had lasting consequences. With less coordination between European and American engineers, these decisions were made independently, optimizing for local conditions. The result was that by the end of the generation, electrical equipment manufactured for American markets could not simply be plugged in and used in Europe, and vice versa. This incompatibility, trivial in itself, stood as a symbol of broader technical divergence. Communications technology advanced on both continents but along different lines. The telephone networks that expanded rapidly in this period developed different switching systems, different protocols, different approaches to long-distance transmission. Radio broadcasting, coming into its own during these years, established different frequency allocations and different regulatory frameworks. Each system worked well within its home continent but could not easily interconnect with the other. The dream of instantaneous transatlantic communication persisted, but the reality was that even the cable links that remained required complex adaptations to bridge incompatible systems. Industrial production became increasingly specialized for continental markets. A factory in Germany designing agricultural equipment optimized for European field sizes and European farming practices. A factory in Illinois designed for American conditions with different priorities and different scale. The machines, while serving similar purposes, were not interchangeable. This specialization extended to consumer goods, kitchen appliances designed for European electrical standards and European kitchens, furniture designed for European living spaces and European aesthetic preferences, clothing designed for European bodies and European fashion norms. The same was true in reverse for American products. The result was two partially distinct material cultures. Energy development took particularly different paths. Europe, more densely populated and with more limited domestic fossil fuel resources, invested heavily in maximizing efficiency and developing alternative sources. Hydroelectric power was developed more extensively than it might otherwise have been. Coal mining was intensified even in less productive regions. Research into new energy sources received more support. America, with abundant domestic oil and coal and more space for extensive extraction, pursued a path of cheap, plentiful energy. The different energy regimes shaped everything else: industrial processes, residential heating, transportation systems, urban planning. Architecture evolved differently on each side of the Atlantic for reasons both technical and cultural. European architects, working with traditional materials and traditional urban forms, developed modernist movements that responded to specifically European conditions and European debates. American architects, working with different materials and often building in less constrained spaces, developed different approaches. The international style that might have unified architectural practice across the Atlantic instead fragmented into continental variations. Buildings constructed during this period looked different not just in superficial style but in fundamental conception. Different proportions, different relationships to streets and neighbours, different assumptions about how spaces should be used. The divergence in technology and infrastructure created practical barriers to reconnection that would persist even after movement across the Atlantic resumed. A European mechanic could not easily repair an American machine. An American electrician would struggle with European wiring. The incompatibilities went beyond technical specifications to include tacit knowledge, the unwritten rules and common practices that every craft develops but that are rarely formally taught. As a generation of workers on each side learned their trades without exposure to transatlantic alternatives, this tacit knowledge became increasingly parochial. Scientific research, which might have been expected to remain more unified given its universal aspirations, also experienced drift. Not in basic principles, physics and chemistry and biology remained the same across the Atlantic, but in research priorities, institutional structures, and communication patterns. American scientists focused more on problems relevant to American conditions and American industries. European scientists did likewise for Europe. The international conferences that had been routine became rare. The scientific journals that had circulated globally faced difficulty maintaining subscriptions and contributions across the Atlantic. Research papers still crossed eventually, but with enough delay that parallel discoveries became common, different teams solving the same problems independently and sometimes incompatibly. The effect on scientific progress was ambiguous. On one hand, the reduced collaboration meant some redundancy and some loss of efficiency. On the other hand, the independent efforts sometimes produced creative solutions that might not have emerged from unified research programs. The history of innovation has always featured productive competition alongside collaboration, and the Atlantic separation created a natural competitive division. But it also meant that certain ambitious projects that would have required coordinated transatlantic resources simply did not happen, or happened later than they might have. Medical practice diverged in small but significant ways. The training of doctors, the organization of hospitals, the regulation of pharmaceuticals, all developed along paths shaped by national institutions that were no longer in constant dialogue with transatlantic counterparts. Surgical techniques that became standard in American hospitals might be unknown in European ones. Medications common in Europe might be unavailable in America. Public health approaches developed differently in response to different epidemiological conditions and different political cultures. The fundamental science of medicine remained shared, but the practice of medicine became more regionally distinct. As the years accumulated and a generation grew up knowing the Atlantic primarily as a boundary rather than a bridge, the psychological separation deepened in ways that transcended any particular policy or technology. This was perhaps the most profound effect of the break, not the economic adjustments or the military realignments or the cultural divergences, but the shift in collective consciousness about what was normal, what was possible, what was us, and what was them. Children born in the early years of the break and coming of age as it matured had no direct memory of an integrated Atlantic world. For them, the separation was not an unfortunate disruption, but simply the way things were. Europe and America were distant places, as distant in practical terms as China had always been. The idea that people or goods or ideas might once have moved freely and frequently between them seemed as remote as stories of the Roman Empire, historically interesting but not relevant to contemporary life. This generational shift showed itself in small ways that accumulated into a large effect. School lessons about transatlantic relations were taught in the past tense. Maps showed the Atlantic as empty space between continents rather than as a highway connecting them. Career aspirations no longer included the casual possibility of working abroad. A talented engineer might consider moving from one American city to another, but moving to Europe would be extraordinary, requiring special justification and accepting permanent exile. The frame of reference for what constituted the world contracted to more regional bounds. Political consciousness evolved within these contracted frames. Elections were fought over domestic issues and regional concerns, not over transatlantic relations that seemed both distant and unchangeable. Political parties organized around continental interests rather than Atlantic identities. The ideological movements that shaped politics, socialism and liberalism and conservatism and nationalism, developed in conversation with local conditions rather than transatlantic debates. European socialism looked to European models and European thinkers. American progressivism drew on American traditions and American experiences. The movement shared names and sometimes shared basic premises, but they no longer shared the constant exchange of ideas that had once kept them synchronized. The nationalism that emerged during this period was particularly shaped by the separation. Nationalist movements had existed before, of course, but the Atlantic break provided them with new justification and new opportunities. The inability to rely on transatlantic allies made nations more focused on self-sufficiency and more suspicious of others. The cultural divergence made it easier to define national identity against foreign others. The economic reorientation gave practical weight to arguments about national self-determination and national interest over international cooperation. This nationalism was not primarily aggressive or militaristic, though it had those elements in some places. More often, it was defensive and inward-looking, a turning away from the wider world because the wider world seemed unreachable and unreliable. National governments invested in national industries, national infrastructure, national culture. The rhetoric of politics emphasized what made each nation distinct rather than what nations shared. The emotional energy of citizenship focused on local and national concerns rather than on broader solidarities that had become abstract. The media landscape both reflected and reinforced these changes. Newspapers, which had once included substantial coverage of foreign news and especially transatlantic news, reduced that coverage as their audiences grew less interested and as gathering news from across the Atlantic became more difficult. The news that did arrive came through official channels and government briefings more than through independent correspondence. The result was that populations on each side of the Atlantic understood the other primarily through selective and often distorted reporting. This selective reporting created space for propaganda and myth-making. Governments could characterize the other side of the Atlantic in ways that served domestic political purposes, and their populations had little independent information with which to evaluate those characterizations. If a European government wanted to portray America as dangerously unstable, it could select news stories that supported that narrative, and its citizens would have no easy way to know they were getting a partial picture. The same was true in reverse. The Atlantic break did not create propaganda. Governments had always shaped information to serve their interests, but it made propaganda more effective by removing the corrective of direct experience. The historical narratives that emerged during this period became foundational for how populations understood themselves and their place in the world. Every nation constructs historical narratives, but these narratives are usually contested and revised through exposure to alternative perspectives. When a nation's narrative encounters foreign narratives regularly, through travel and trade and cultural exchange, the most extreme distortions are challenged. During the Atlantic break, that challenging process slowed dramatically. European history textbooks taught a story of European civilization that increasingly downplayed America's role or treated it as an interesting but ultimately peripheral development. The narrative arc ran from ancient Greece through Rome, through medieval Christendom, through the Renaissance, through the Enlightenment, through modern Europe, with America appearing as a colonial offshoot that had gone its own way. The implication, rarely stated explicitly but present nonetheless, was that true civilization remained centered in Europe, while America was something else, vigorous perhaps, wealthy certainly, but not quite civilized in the deep sense. American history textbooks taught a different story. In this narrative, America represented the fulfillment of European principles that Europe itself had abandoned. The arc ran from the ancient republics through the Enlightenment, through the American Revolution, through continental expansion, through industrial development, with Europe appearing as the place Americans had left behind, a region trapped in old conflicts and old hierarchies while America built something new. The implication, again rarely explicit but powerfully present, was that the future belonged to America while Europe represented the past. Both narratives contained truth and both contained distortion, but populations growing up immersed in one narrative or the other had little basis for recognizing the distortions. The shared history that had bound Europe and America, the common intellectual heritage, the cultural connections, the economic integration, receded into abstraction, replaced by stories that emphasized distinctiveness and divergence. This was not a conspiracy, or a coordinated effort, but an organic process of meaning-making in conditions of separation. The long-term effect was the creation of two distinct historical consciousnesses. Events that had been experienced as shared history, wars, economic crises, cultural movements, were remembered differently on each side of the Atlantic, incorporated into different narrative frameworks, and assigned different meanings. The diverging memories created diverging expectations about the future. If Europeans and Americans understood their past differently, they necessarily understood their presents differently, and imagined their futures differently. The question of reconnection began to arise before the infrastructure for reconnection actually existed. As the generation wore on, and some of the initial causes of disruption were addressed or faded, voices on both sides of the Atlantic began advocating for renewed exchange. But the advocacy faced not just practical obstacles but psychological ones. A substantial portion of the population on each side had grown comfortable with separation, or at least had adapted to it, and saw little reason to bear the costs and risks of reconnection. The arguments for reconnection were both practical and sentimental. Trade, the advocates argued, would benefit both sides. Cultural exchange would enrich both civilizations. Scientific collaboration would accelerate progress. And beyond these practical benefits, there were ties of heritage and common humanity that should not be permanently severed. These arguments had force, but they competed against powerful inertia and against interests that had grown up around the separation. Businesses that had prospered by serving newly regional markets worried that renewed transatlantic competition would threaten their positions. Workers in industries that had expanded to replace transatlantic imports worried about job security. Politicians whose careers had been built on nationalist rhetoric found it difficult to shift to supporting internationalism. Cultural institutions that had defined themselves by their regional character worried that renewed exchange would mean subordination to foreign standards. The constituencies favouring continued separation were not a majority, but they were vocal and organised. The first tentative steps toward reconnection came through technology rather than policy. New ship designs promised safer Atlantic crossings. Insurance companies, seeing the potential for profit, began cautiously offering coverage under stringent conditions. Communications companies upgraded cable infrastructure to handle higher volumes. These improvements did not restore the old ease of crossing, but they made crossing possible for those with sufficient resources and sufficient motivation. The initial renewed crossings were undertaken primarily by diplomats and business leaders, people whose professional interests required direct contact across the Atlantic. These pioneers found the experience strange and disorienting. The Europe that American visitors encountered was familiar in some ways but alien in others. The accents had drifted. The social customs had evolved. The political references and cultural touchstones that shaped conversation were different enough to require constant explanation and adjustment. European visitors to America reported similar experiences, a sense of recognizing something they had known, but finding it changed in ways they could not quite name. The practical incompatibilities that had developed during the separation created constant friction. An American businessman trying to operate in Europe had to navigate not just different business practices, but different systems of measurement, different electrical standards, different communication protocols. A European artist touring in America found that agreements about contract terms meant different things, that promotional materials needed not just translation but cultural adaptation, that assumptions about how events should be organized were not shared. These were not insurmountable obstacles, but they required constant negotiation and adjustment. The most jarring discovery for many who reconnected was how much the other side had changed, while retaining the conviction that they had stayed true to essential values. Americans arriving in Europe sometimes felt they were visiting a museum culture, too attached to tradition and suspicious of innovation. Europeans arriving in America sometimes felt they were visiting a crude frontier, all energy and appetite without refinement or reflection. Both sides were partially right and partially wrong, but neither had the historical context to understand how the changes had occurred or why they felt natural to those who had lived through them. Language proved a particularly revealing site of friction. American English and British English had diverged enough that simple conversation sometimes required clarification. New words had entered the vocabulary on each side. Old words had shifted in meaning. Idioms had emerged that were opaque to outsiders. Pronunciation had drifted. The differences were not enough to make communication impossible, but they were enough to make it feel foreign, to create a subtle sense of distance even in conversation. For people old enough to remember when the linguistic gap had been smaller, the change was melancholy. For younger people who had never known a time of closer connection, it simply confirmed that America and Europe were, in fact, different places with different cultures. As travel increased gradually over several years, patterns of exchange began to re-establish themselves, but they remained far below the levels of the pre-break era. Tourism resumed on a small scale, attracting those wealthy enough to afford the still high costs and adventurous enough to accept the still significant uncertainties. Trade increased, but within carefully negotiated frameworks that acknowledged the divergent standards and practices that had developed. Cultural exchange resumed, but with the recognition that what crossed would need adaptation for new audiences. The process of reconnection became entangled with questions of dominance and subordination. In some domains, American standards had become dominant during the separation, in certain industries, in certain technologies, in certain business practices. In other domains, European standards held sway. As exchange resumed, There were winners and losers in the struggle over which standards would be adopted where. These struggles were rarely purely technical. They carried implications for economic advantage, for cultural identity, for national pride. The negotiations were often bitter and prolonged. Governments approached reconnection with extreme caution, neither fully embracing nor fully resisting it. Trade treaties were negotiated that opened some sectors while protecting others. Security arrangements were discussed that offered limited cooperation while maintaining full sovereign control. Cultural agreements facilitated some exchange while ensuring that national institutions retained their autonomy. The result was a patchwork of partial reconnections, each carefully circumscribed, each reflecting the tension between the desire for renewed contact and the fear of losing what had been built during separation. The generation that had grown up during the break found itself torn. Some, especially in cosmopolitan centres, embraced reconnection eagerly, seeing it as an opportunity to transcend the limitations of their regional world. Others, especially in areas that had prospered during separation or had developed strong regional identities, resisted it as a threat to their way of life. Political movements formed around these competing visions: internationalists who wanted rapid and comprehensive reconnection, nationalists who wanted to maintain separation, and various gradations between these poles. As the years passed and reconnection proceeded, unevenly and incompletely, the defining question became not whether the Atlantic would be bridged again, but what kind of bridge it would be. The old assumption of easy, constant, relatively open exchange seemed unlikely to return. The divergences were too substantial, the interest too entrenched, the consciousness of separation too deep. Instead, what emerged was something more managed and more conditional, exchange that happened through official channels more than organic flow, movement that required permission and explanation rather than simple decision. The memory of separation lingered even as contact increased. Those who remembered the break and lived through it carried a wariness, a knowledge that the Atlantic could become a barrier again if circumstances changed. They did not take connection for granted the way earlier generations had. They diversified their relationships and their supply chains, maintaining regional alternatives even as transatlantic options became available again. The psychological scar of the break proved more lasting than any physical disruption. On a rainy evening in a European port city, an elderly man stands at a window looking out at the harbour. He's old enough to remember ships leaving every day for America, old enough to have watched the traffic dwindle and the silence settle over the docks. Now, in his old age, he sees occasional ships again, new vessels built for the reopened routes, but the harbour will never be what it was in his youth. Too much has changed. Too much has been learned about the fragility of connection. The Atlantic stretches before him, patient and dark, neither highway nor wall, but something more ambiguous, a space that can be crossed certainly, but only with intention, only with effort, only with awareness that what is joined can also be separated. In an American city, a young woman sits in a library reading a European novel in translation. She has never visited Europe and likely never will. The crossing is still too expensive for someone of her circumstances. But the book fascinates her precisely because it describes a world that is both familiar and foreign, similar in some ways to her own, but operating according to different rules and different assumptions. She wonders what it would be like to live there, whether she would recognize the world she's read about or whether the reality would be too strange to navigate. The wondering is pleasant, but also melancholy. She lives in an age of reconnection, but reconnection has not made distance disappear. It has only made absence more visible. Across the ocean from each other, these two people represent the world the Atlantic break has created, a world where movement is possible but costly, where connection exists but requires maintenance, where separation has left marks that cannot be fully erased. The break did not destroy modernity, or end progress, or create disaster. It simply changed the geography of human possibility, making some things harder and other things easier, drawing lines that had been blurred and blurring lines that had been clear. The story of the Atlantic break is not a story of catastrophe but of transformation. It is a reminder that the infrastructure of connection, the ships and cables and treaties and trust that allow people and goods and ideas to move, is not natural or inevitable, but constructed and maintained, and that when it fails, the world adapts. The adaptation is not always graceful and not always fair, but it happens. Life continues, prosperity continues, culture continues, but in patterns shaped by new constraints. The 21st century in this timeline would inherit a world marked by that long separation. The economic systems, the political alignments, the cultural forms, the technological standards, all would bear its imprint. Whether reconnection would eventually erase those marks, or whether they would persist indefinitely remained an open question. Perhaps the Atlantic would someday return to being what it once was, a casual highway binding continents. Or perhaps the memory of the break would always colour how people thought about distance and connection, making them more aware of fragility and more deliberate about maintaining what they had built. The rain continues to fall softly on the harbour, on the ocean, on both shores. The lights of the city reflect in the wet streets. Somewhere out there, beyond the darkness, the other side exists. Different now, changed, but still there. The door that closed has opened again. Not all the way, not easily, but open nonetheless. What passes through it and how that movement shapes the future remains to be written. For now, the ocean rests quiet in the darkness, neither barrier nor bridge but possibility itself, waiting. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The war does not end with flags raised over ruined capitals or with signatures on a ship deck under camera flashes. It ends in a series of meetings held in neutral cities where diplomats arrive exhausted and leave with documents that feel more like postponements than conclusions. The year is 1944, and the largest conflict in human history stops not because one side has been defeated, but because the cost of continuing has become harder to justify than the uncertainty of stopping. There are no victory parades. There are communiques read over radio in measured tones, and then there is silence, and then there is the long work of learning to live inside that silence. The path to this moment is not a single catastrophic event, but an accumulation of limits. The Battle of the Atlantic proves more costly than anticipated, with convoy losses mounting through 1943 in ways that strain industrial replacement capacity. Shipping tonnage becomes a number that appears in closed-door briefings with increasing frequency, always slightly worse than the previous month's projections. The invasion of mainland Europe, when it comes, succeeds in establishing beachheads but stalls in the subsequent advance, grinding into a war of attrition that resembles the Western Front of the previous war more than anyone wishes to acknowledge. Casualties arrive in numbers that fill field hospitals faster than transport can evacuate them. The public, initially rallied by calls to duty, begins to fracture as the war stretches into its fifth year with no clear endpoint visible. In the Pacific, island campaigns become exercises in calculating acceptable losses, and each calculation becomes harder to justify to populations already worn by rationing and absence. Strategic bombing campaigns continue, but their effectiveness becomes a matter of bitter internal debate among military planners, who privately admit that tonnage dropped does not always correlate with strategic gain. The resources required to maintain multiple theatres of operation across two oceans create logistical puzzles that have no clean solutions, only trade-offs. Every gain in one area means a delay or a reduced commitment somewhere else. The war becomes a system that consumes everything fed into it, without producing the decisive outcomes that might justify that consumption. Political pressure builds in ways that are difficult to trace in any single moment, but impossible to ignore in aggregate. Labour strikes occur despite wartime restrictions. Editorials begin to appear in newspapers questioning not the righteousness of the cause, but the sustainability of the effort. Congressional hearings probe procurement failures and cost overruns with increasing sharpness. Allies express frustration in diplomatic cables that grow less diplomatic with each iteration. The Soviet Union, bearing the heaviest burden of the Eastern Front, begins to signal that its capacity for offensive operations is reaching limits that ideology cannot overcome. Britain, exhausted by years of bombardment and blockade, faces a domestic political landscape where even Churchill's rhetoric cannot entirely mask the reality of depleted reserves and fraying imperial commitments. Into this atmosphere of compounding strain comes the proposal that will eventually become the armistice. It originates not from any single government, but from quiet channels, diplomatic feelers extended through neutral states, unofficial conversations in consulates, back-channel messages that explore whether the other side might be willing to stop fighting if the terms were something other than unconditional surrender. The initial responses are cautious but not dismissive. Over months, these tentative exchanges gain structure. Working groups form, language is drafted, rejected, revised. The process is slow and secretive, and when it finally becomes public, it arrives not as a dramatic announcement, but as a fait accompli presented to populations too tired to do more than absorb the news in numb relief. The armistice itself is a peculiar document. It does not declare victory or defeat. It establishes what it calls lines of administrative control rather than permanent borders. It creates inspection regimes and demilitarized zones, mechanisms for prisoner exchange and humanitarian access, protocols for disputed territories and contested resources. The language is technical, bureaucratic, designed to defer rather than resolve. Crucially, it leaves in place the governments that controlled territory at the moment fighting stopped. There is no occupation of Berlin, no liberation of Paris in the sense those words would have meant in another timeline. The map of Europe at the moment the guns fall silent becomes, through legal formalism, the map of Europe going forward. What this means in practice is that Axis control consolidates across a vast swathe of the continent. The administrative apparatus built during wartime, the systems of surveillance, censorship, economic control and ideological enforcement does not dismantle. Instead, it transitions from emergency measure to permanent governance. The security state, once justified as a temporary necessity of total war, becomes simply the state. Borders close not for military reasons but for administrative ones. Travel requires permits, publications require approval, education curricula are standardized around narratives of order and stability. The machinery of control, having been built, continues to operate because dismantling it would require an external force that the armistice has specifically ruled out. In these territories, life develops a quality that is difficult to describe to those who have not lived it. It is not constant terror, because terror cannot be sustained at high intensity across years and decades without exhausting both those who inflict it and those who endure it. Instead, it is a pervasive caution, a learned wariness that becomes second nature. People develop an instinct for what can be said in which contexts. They become fluent in a kind of doublespeak, where official language is used in official settings and private truth is reserved for private spaces, spoken in lowered voices behind closed doors. Trust becomes a rare commodity, distributed carefully among family and a very small circle of intimates. The public square is for performance. Real life happens in kitchens, in basements, encoded phrases that mean one thing to listeners who know and something innocuous to those who do not. The educational system in these regions becomes a particular focus of state attention. Children are taught history as a narrative of necessary order, triumphing over chaos, of stability achieved through strength. Maps show the lines of administrative control as natural and permanent. Literature curricula emphasize themes of duty, sacrifice, and collective belonging. Teachers who deviate from approved materials find their contracts not renewed. Students who ask inconvenient questions are noted in files that follow them into university admissions and employment applications. Over time, this creates a generation that has only ever known one version of the world, for whom the pre-war period exists only as a vague, semi-mythical time described in whispers by grandparents who remember. The economic structure in these territories reorganizes around controlled trade networks. Resources flow along channels determined by state priorities rather than market forces. Factories produce goods according to central allocation plans. Labour is directed toward projects deemed essential to national strength. There is employment, there is housing, there is food distribution, but all of it operates within frameworks that prioritize control over efficiency. Consumer goods exist but are often shoddy, produced to meet quotas rather than satisfy demand. Black markets develop to fill gaps, tolerated when useful, cracked down upon when they grow too visible or too competitive with official channels. In the territories that remain outside Axis control, the armistice creates a different kind of strain. There is relief that the fighting has stopped, but also a profound unease about what has been accepted in exchange for that relief. Political debates become bitter and personal. Accusations fly about who advocated for the armistice, and whether they were defeatists or realists. Veterans return to societies that don't quite know how to receive them, because there is no victory to celebrate but also no defeat to mourn. They are treated with a kind of awkward deference, honoured in ceremony but not quite integrated into the narrative of what happened and why. The western portions of Europe that remain outside direct Axis control develop into a nervous borderland. Cities near the demilitarized zones feel the proximity of the line as a constant presence. Military installations remain at a state of permanent readiness, not quite at war but not at peace either. Trade with the controlled territories is limited and heavily regulated. Refugees who manage to cross over arrive with stories that are difficult to verify and harder to know what to do about. Governments in these regions walk a careful line, maintaining defensive readiness while avoiding provocations that might give excuse for the armistice to collapse. In Britain, the armistice is received with an exhausted ambivalence. The island has survived, but at a cost that will take decades to fully account. The economy, mobilised for total war, must now retool without the stimulus of reconstruction aid or the psychological boost of clear victory. Rationing continues longer than anyone hoped. The empire, already straining under the weight of nationalist movements, begins to fracture more rapidly without the binding narrative of having stood firm in a great moral struggle. The question of what Britain fought for, if the outcome is a frozen standoff, becomes a source of painful national introspection. Across the Atlantic, the United States faces its own reckoning with the armistice. The industrial mobilization that transformed the economy does not simply reverse. Factories that produce tanks and aircraft and ships must find new purposes. Workers who filled those factories must find new roles. The GI Bill still exists, but it operates in a context where the returning service members are not heroes of a great victory but participants in an effort that ended ambiguously. The mood is not triumphant. There is a weariness, a sense of having expended enormous energy without achieving the transformation that might have justified it. The political fallout is intense and prolonged. Investigations are launched into why the war ended as it did. Fingers are pointed. Reputations are built on having opposed the armistice, on having been more willing to continue the fight. The debate over whether the nation was betrayed or rescued becomes a defining fault line in politics for years. Elections turn on the question. The trauma of the ambiguous ending, the lack of closure, the impossibility of declaring that all the sacrifice meant something definitive, these become persistent features of the political landscape. In the Pacific, the armistice creates a world of negotiated zones and contested waters. Strategic islands become checkpoints in a network of controlled passages. Japan retains control over vast territories, and that control is enforced through a combination of military presence and administrative integration. The co-prosperity sphere, as it is officially termed, is not a voluntary association but a hierarchical system with Tokyo, at the centre, issuing directives that radiate outward through layers of regional administration. Resources flow toward the core. Labour is extracted. Local elites are co-opted or replaced. Resistance is met with reprisals that are calculated to instill maximum deterrent effect. For the populations living under this arrangement, life becomes a negotiation with power that is distant but omnipresent. Bureaucracy multiplies. Permits are required for commerce, for travel, for gatherings of any significant size. Language policy enforces the use of Japanese in official contexts, creating a bifurcated society where older generations maintain native tongues in private, while younger generations are educated into linguistic assimilation. Cultural production is censored and shaped, with traditional arts encouraged when they can be presented as part of a larger regional heritage, and suppressed when they carry hints of separate identity or resistance. The ocean itself changes character. What was once open water becomes a space of surveillance and control. Shipping lanes are monitored. Fishing vessels require registration and transponders. Naval patrols are frequent and unpredictable. The sense of living on an island is no longer about isolation in a romantic sense, but about being trapped in a monitored zone where movement is observed and regulated. This creates a particular psychological pressure, a feeling of the horizon being closer than it appears, of the world being smaller than the map would suggest. In the regions that remain outside direct Japanese control, the armistice brings a different kind of tension. Australia and New Zealand exist in a state of perpetual strategic anxiety, maintaining military readiness and alliance commitments that drain resources but seem necessary given the proximity of the line. The Philippines, caught in a contested status, become a source of ongoing diplomatic friction. Smuggling networks develop to move people and goods across the lines, tolerated by both sides when convenient, disrupted when political winds shift. The South China Sea becomes less a body of water than a political membrane, separating but also connecting, with crossings that carry weight and risk. Resistance movements, in both European and Pacific theatres, do not get the moment of liberation that would allow them to emerge into daylight and be celebrated. Instead, they persist as underground networks that must sustain themselves across years and then decades. This changes their character fundamentally. They cannot operate on the assumption that the current state of affairs is temporary, that help is coming, that history is on their side. They must plan for continuity across generations, and that planning shapes everything they do. Safe houses become permanent institutions, passed down within families. Children grow up knowing certain rooms are not to be discussed, certain visitors are not to be mentioned, certain times require absolute silence. Networks of trust are built slowly, tested repeatedly, maintained through a combination of personal loyalty and shared risk. The work is often mundane, hiding someone for a night, passing a message, storing papers in a false bottom drawer. The dramatic acts of sabotage that marked wartime resistance become rarer, too risky when there is no imminent prospect of liberation to justify the reprisals they would provoke. Instead, the resistance turns its energy toward cultural preservation. Underground schools teach forbidden histories, languages that official curricula suppress, literatures that are no longer allowed in public libraries. Printing presses operate in basements, producing pamphlets and newsletters that circulate hand to hand, read, and then burn to leave no evidence. Music is preserved through memory, sung in gatherings that have no record, passed from teacher to student in chains of oral transmission. The resistance becomes less a military force waiting to strike than a parallel society maintaining an alternative version of reality, keeping alive the idea that the current order is not natural, not inevitable, not permanent. This long-duration resistance develops its own culture and rituals. There are coded songs that sound innocent to outsiders, but carry layers of meaning to those who know. There are symbols that appear in graffiti, quickly painted and quickly scrubbed away but recognized and passed on. There are anniversaries marked in private, dates that commemorate events the official calendar does not acknowledge. Over time, this underground life develops a richness that is invisible from the outside, but deeply sustaining to those who participate in it. It is exhausting, it is dangerous, but it is also purposeful in a way that collaboration or passive acceptance is not. The nuclear question unfolds very differently in this timeline. Without a demonstration of decisive victory through atomic weapons, the programs that would lead to their development proceed along different lines, driven by different motivations. In a world of frozen borders and perpetual standoff, the bomb is not a war-ending weapon, but a strategic lever, a form of insurance, a deterrent that must be obtained because others are obtaining it. The race is less about winning, and more about not falling behind, and this changes the character of the competition. Multiple powers pursue nuclear capability in an atmosphere of intense secrecy and mutual suspicion. The United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and eventually others pour resources into programs that are barely acknowledged publicly, but are open secrets in diplomatic and intelligence circles. Espionage becomes obsessive. Scientists who work on these programs are watched, their communications monitored, their movements tracked. Defections, when they occur, cause international incidents. The knowledge of how to build the weapons spreads slowly but inexorably, despite every effort to contain it. The result is a multipolar nuclear world that emerges earlier and with less institutional structure than in the timeline we know. There is no clear moment of superiority, no period where one side possesses the weapons and others do not. Instead, there is a gradual, nerve-wracking diffusion of capability, with each announcement of a successful test met by escalated efforts elsewhere. The arms race, if it can be called that, is less a sprint than a grinding march, with each side acquiring weapons not out of confidence, but out of fear of what might happen if they do not. Deterrence in this environment is fragile and untested. The doctrines that govern use are developed in real time, without the benefit of historical precedent or widely shared strategic theory. Protocols are established, sometimes through formal negotiation, more often through signalling and tacit understanding. Hotlines are eventually installed, but they are untested and their reliability is uncertain. War games are conducted in classified facilities, attempting to model how confrontations might escalate and where the stopping points might be, But the models are crude and the variables are too many. The overriding feeling is not stability but a kind of anxious stasis, where everyone understands that the weapons exist but no one is quite sure how the system would behave under pressure. The economic recovery that follows the armistice is slow, uneven, and fragmented. Without the psychological clarity of victory, without the sense that the sacrifices were vindicated by a clear outcome, the drive to rebuild lacks the unifying energy it might have had. Trade blocs form along the lines of control established by the armistice. Currencies do not freely convert. Capital flows are restricted. The international financial architecture that might have coordinated reconstruction remains rudimentary and politicized. In the territories under Axis control, economic development is directed by state priorities. Heavy industry is emphasized. Consumer production is secondary. Living standards improve slowly, in fits and starts, with gains that are often clawed back by policy shifts or resource diversion. The command economy delivers employment and basic security, but at the cost of efficiency and innovation. Black markets provide what official channels cannot, and their existence is tolerated within limits, suppressed when they threaten state control. In the West, recovery is faster but still constrained. American industry, having mobilized for war, must now find markets in a world that is divided and protected. European reconstruction happens with American capital, but under conditions that are never quite stable enough to inspire full confidence. Investment is cautious. Business planning operates on shorter time horizons. The boom that might have been is replaced by a more tentative growth, constantly looking over its shoulder at the frozen borders and the unresolved tensions they represent. Consumer culture develops in this context, but with a different flavor. The abundance exists, or begins to exist, but it is shadowed by awareness of fragility. Advertising sells not just products, but the idea of normalcy, of a return to peacetime pleasures that might distract from the underlying tensions. But the normalcy never quite feels complete. There is always a sense that this could be disrupted, that the armistice might not hold, that the strange peace could give way to something worse. Globally, the armistice reshapes the landscape of decolonization and civil rights movements. The moral language that might have emerged from a clear Allied victory, the rhetoric of freedom defeating tyranny, of universal rights vindicated by military success, is muddied by the ambiguous ending. The colonized peoples of Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean find themselves in a world where the European powers are weakened but not decisively so, where the United States is powerful but cautious, where the Soviet Union is focused on its own borders and immediate security. Independence movements continue, but they operate without the tailwind of a victorious liberal internationalism. Where they succeed, it is through their own efforts, through long campaigns of civil resistance, negotiation, and sometimes armed struggle. The victories, when they come, are hard-won and often partial. Borders are drawn hastily and sometimes cruelly. Newly independent nations inherit fragile economies and contested legitimacies. The great powers offer aid but with strings attached, seeking advantage in the competition that continues even after the formal war has ended. In the United States, the civil rights movement unfolds in a context where the nation cannot as easily claim moral authority on the world stage. The contradiction between stated ideals and domestic realities is still glaring, but the imperative to resolve it is less pressing when there is no clear victory narrative to uphold. Progress happens but through grinding campaigns, legal challenges, local organizing, courage in the face of violence. The movement must build its own momentum without the boost that might have come from a more triumphant national mood. The rhythm of daily life in this long standoff develops its own patterns. News is consumed carefully, with an eye toward reading between the lines. Media in controlled territories operates under censorship that is pervasive but not always obvious. Stories are shaped through omission rather than overt propaganda, through emphasis and framing rather than outright lies. People learn to decode this, to understand what is not being said, to compare notes in trusted circles about what might actually be happening. In households, families develop strategies for navigating the tension between public and private life. Children are taught to be careful, to understand that not everything that is said at home can be repeated at school. Parents make calculations about how much truth to share, how much to protect their children through ignorance, how to prepare them for a world that requires constant vigilance without crushing them under the weight of that requirement. Rituals of normalcy are maintained with a kind of determined ordinariness. Holidays are celebrated, birthdays are marked, weddings and funerals proceed with their traditional forms, but underneath there is always the awareness of the larger situation, the frozen conflict, the unresolved tensions. Gatherings have a tentative quality, a sense that this moment of peace or celebration is carved out of something larger and less stable. Travel, where it is permitted, carries a weight it would not have in a more open world. Crossing borders, even the ones that are officially open, involves documentation and scrutiny. Letters are written with the knowledge that they may be read by others. Phone calls, when they connect across the lines, are assumed to be monitored. The infrastructure of surveillance is not always visible, but its possibility shapes behaviour. People self-censor not because they are constantly watched, but because they might be. And the stakes of being caught in disfavoured speech are high enough that caution becomes automatic. Professional life in controlled territories requires a particular kind of navigation. Advancement often depends on demonstrated loyalty, on participation in approved organisations, on avoidance of anything that might mark one as unreliable. Careers are built by those who are good at performing compliance, at navigating bureaucracies, at understanding where the lines are without needing them to be explicitly drawn. Those with talent but insufficient political reliability find themselves relegated to positions where their skills can be used but their influence limited. In academic and intellectual life, the constraints are particularly acute. Research agendas must align with state priorities. Publications must pass through review processes that assess political content as carefully as scholarly merit. International conferences, when they happen, are carefully managed affairs where participants understand they are representing their nations as much as their disciplines. The free exchange of ideas exists in theory and in carefully monitored practice, but the monitoring changes what can be exchanged. The arts develop under these conditions in complex ways. Official art is produced, funded by the state, celebrating approved themes. It is often technically accomplished but emotionally hollow, propaganda dressed in aesthetic form. But alongside this, a shadow cultural production exists, work that is created in private, shared in small circles, sometimes smuggled across borders. This underground culture is not always overtly political. Sometimes it's simply honest, dealing with human experiences that do not fit the official narratives. Its existence is itself a form of resistance, a refusal to let all expression be shaped by the needs of the state. Music becomes a particularly important vehicle for this alternative culture. Songs can be learned without written record, passed orally, modified through performance. They can carry meanings that shift depending on context. A love song that is also about longing for freedom. A folk tune that preserves regional identity in the face of cultural homogenization. Musicians who operate in this space develop reputations that spread through word of mouth, through hand-dubbed recordings that circulate unofficially, through performances in venues that are not quite legal but not quite forbidden. Science and technology progress, but in directions shaped by the strategic priorities of the standoff. Research funding flows toward areas with military application. Materials science, rocketry, computing, nuclear physics. Civilian benefits spin off from these efforts but as secondary effects. The space race, when it develops, is less about exploration than demonstration, each launch a signal of capability and reach. The moon, if it is reached, will be reached as a way of saying something about power projection, not wonder. The world that develops across the decades following the armistice is one of deep divisions that are accepted as permanent features rather than problems to be solved. Children grow up learning the map as it is, not imagining that it might be different. The lines of administrative control, which were supposed to be temporary arrangements pending a final settlement, become simply how the world is organized. Diplomatic efforts to move beyond the armistice framework occur periodically, but founder on the same obstacles. No side willing to give up what it controls, no consensus on what a better arrangement would look like, no trust sufficient to take risks for change. Trade happens across these divides, but always within frameworks of control and suspicion. Goods are inspected, tariffs are high, disputes are frequent. Tourism, where it exists, is managed, with visitors granted limited access to approved sites and monitored throughout their stays. Scientific exchange happens but in carefully bounded channels, with each side seeking knowledge while guarding its own advances. The porousness that might allow for organic integration never develops, and the divisions harden into structures that become self-reinforcing, Generations born after the armistice come of age knowing only this world. The war itself becomes history, taught in schools with competing narratives that depend on which side of the lines you live on. Veterans age and die, taking with them the living memory of what came before. The question of whether the armistice was right or wrong, necessary or tragic, becomes more abstract as the people who made those decisions pass from the scene. What remains is the structure itself, the system of frozen borders and perpetual standoff that has become the normal state of international affairs. Political thought develops around the question of how to live in permanent uncertainty. Philosophers write about the ethics of compromise, the responsibilities of generations that inherit conflicts they did not start, the possibility of finding meaning in a world that offers no clear resolutions. Literature explores the psychology of living in between, neither at war nor at peace, neither entirely free nor entirely oppressed, always aware of the larger forces that constrain individual lives, but also always finding small spaces of autonomy and dignity within those constraints. Religious and spiritual movements grapple with the theodicy of the situation, how to understand a world where such enormous suffering was followed not by resolution but by prolonged ambiguity. Some find in this a call to focus on personal virtue, on building small communities of care and meaning that can exist regardless of larger political structures. Others develop theologies of resistance, framing the struggle against oppression as a spiritual discipline, a way of maintaining human dignity in inhospitable circumstances. The diversity of responses reflects the impossibility of any single narrative encompassing the experience. As decades pass, technology changes the texture of the standoff without fundamentally altering its structure. Communications improve, but they are monitored. Travel becomes faster, but border controls remain. Information flows more readily, but censorship adapts, becoming more sophisticated in its methods. The fundamental fact of division remains. Only the tools for managing it evolve. The environmental consequences of this world begin to manifest slowly. Industrial policy driven by strategic competition rather than sustainability leads to degradation that is noted but not prioritized. Rivers are polluted, air quality declines in industrial centers, forests are cleared for resource extraction. The problems are recognized, but addressing them would require cooperation that the system cannot produce. Environmental movements emerge but struggle to gain traction against the imperatives of strategic positioning and economic competition. Health systems develop unevenly. In wealthier regions on both sides of the divide, medical advances continue, driven by military needs that have civilian spillovers. Antibiotics are developed, vaccines are improved, surgical techniques advance. But access is uneven, shaped by the hierarchies of the system. In poorer regions, in rural areas, in places deemed less strategically important, medicine remains rudimentary and care is scarce. Epidemics, when they occur, are managed at borders rather than through cooperative public health efforts. The psychological toll of living in this prolonged standoff is substantial but difficult to measure. There is a baseline level of stress that becomes so normal it is hardly noticed. The awareness that stability is contingent, that the peace is frozen rather than genuine, that force remains the ultimate arbiter of disputes even if it is held in reserve. This manifests in various ways: higher rates of anxiety disorders, substance use as a coping mechanism, a dark cynicism in popular culture that treats idealism as naive, and survival as the highest virtue. But there are also forms of resilience that develop. Communities that have lived through this for decades develop deep bonds of mutual support. Families treasure their private spaces as refuges from the public performance required in official contexts. Friendships are valued intensely when they are built on genuine trust rather than strategic advantage. The small joys, a good meal, a moment of laughter, a child's achievement, a garden in bloom, take on heightened significance as assertions of life against the deadening weight of the larger system. Art that emerges from this context, particularly the unofficial art, develops a particular aesthetic, spare, ironic, attentive to small details and private moments, suspicious of grand narratives, finding beauty and persistence rather than triumph. Literature from the underground presses is marked by an attention to the texture of daily life under constraint, to the small decisions that define character when large actions are foreclosed. The stories are often quiet, focused on individuals navigating impossible situations without clear heroic options, finding dignity in simply enduring with integrity. Music from this period, particularly the music that circulates unofficially, has a melancholic quality, even when the tempo is upbeat. The lyrics are often elliptical, saying things slant because direct statement is dangerous. Melodies draw on traditional forms but combine them in new ways, creating hybrids that reflect the Hunza reality of life under these conditions. Performances are treasured as moments of communal recognition, where people come together to hear articulated feelings that cannot be spoken directly in other contexts. The educational experience of children growing up in this world is marked by contradictions. Official curricula teach one version of reality, but many children also receive alternative education at home or in underground schools. They learn to code switch, to give the expected answers in school while retaining private knowledge that contradicts those answers. This creates a kind of double consciousness, an ability to hold multiple versions of truth simultaneously and to navigate between them depending on context. Sports and games take on heightened importance as domains where competition can be expressed without deadly consequences. International competitions, when they happen, are charged with significance beyond the contests themselves. Victories are celebrated as validations of national worth. Defeats are passed for political meaning. Athletes become proxies in a struggle that cannot be fought directly. The Olympics, if they continue, are less celebrations of human achievement than venues for demonstrating relative standing in the larger competition. Technology industries develop along separate tracks on either side of the divide. Standards are incompatible, systems do not communicate, and each side develops its own ecosystem of innovation. This duplication is inefficient but seems necessary given the lack of trust. Corporate espionage is rampant, with companies constantly working to reverse engineer competitors' advances. Patent disputes are impossible to resolve across jurisdictional lines, leading to parallel innovations that never quite benefit from each other's insights. The Internet, when it begins to develop, emerges as fragmented networks rather than a single global system. Protocols are different, access is controlled, and content is filtered. The vision of universal connection remains just that, a vision never realized. Instead, there are separate digital domains that mirror the physical divisions, with crossing between them difficult and monitored. This shapes how information flows, how communities form online, how digital culture develops. The potential for a global digital commons is foreclosed by the imperatives of control. Financial systems remain stubbornly separate. Currencies do not freely convert, capital controls are strict, and international transactions are cumbersome. This limits economic integration and keeps living standards lower than they might otherwise be. It also creates opportunities for those who can navigate the complexities. Arbitrageurs, smugglers, officials who can be bribed to facilitate transfers. Corruption becomes endemic because the systems are so rigid that circumventing them is often the only way to accomplish necessary tasks. In the realm of migration, the frozen borders create pools of stateless people, refugees from the initial conflict who never found permanent homes, and subsequent generations born in displacement. Camps that were supposed to be temporary become permanent settlements. People spend entire lives in limbo, neither able to return to places that are no longer accessible, nor fully integrated into the places where they have landed. The international organizations that might address this are weak and chronically underfunded, their mandates contested by states that see refugee populations as burdens or potential security threats. For women, the trajectory of rights and opportunities is shaped by the nature of the systems they live within. In authoritarian territories, women are mobilized when it serves state needs, as workers, as mothers of future citizens, but are constrained in personal autonomy. Education is provided but channeled toward approved roles. Reproductive choices are limited by policy. Domestic violence is treated as a private matter, unworthy of state intervention. In the territories outside direct Axis control, progress toward equality happens but unevenly, region by region, often against significant resistance. The question of justice for wartime atrocities is never satisfactorily resolved. Without a clear victor, there is no tribunal, no comprehensive accounting. Victims know what happened to them, but there is no official recognition, no punishment for perpetrators who now live openly as respected members of society in territories where their crimes are either denied or justified. This creates a persistent wound in the collective psyche, a sense, that the moral order of the universe is broken when such things can happen without consequence. Memory itself becomes contested terrain. In controlled territories, the official version of history is enforced through education, through commemorations, through the architecture of public memory. Monuments are built to celebrate the order that was achieved, the stability that was preserved. Counter-memories are preserved in private, in family stories, in underground literature, in places of pilgrimage that have meaning to those who know but are unremarkable to those who do not. The passage of time does not heal these divisions so much as transform them. The urgency of the immediate post-war period gives way to a kind of tired acceptance. People focus on their immediate lives, on raising children, on building careers, on the small satisfactions that are available within the constraints of the system. Politics, which once felt like life or death, becomes background noise, something that happens in distant capitals and affects daily life only indirectly. The standoff becomes simply how the world is, a fact as basic as geography. But underneath this surface normalization, the tensions remain. The unresolved questions do not disappear just because they are no longer actively discussed. They are passed down, transmitted across generations in quiet ways. A grandparent's bitter aside, a parent's careful explanation of why certain topics are not discussed outside the home, a sudden break in conversation when the wrong person approaches. These moments accumulate, shaping understanding even when the direct experience of the war has faded into history. When confrontations do occur, they are sharp and dangerous precisely because there is no established mechanism for resolving them. Each incident, a border dispute, a trade disagreement, an espionage revelation, has the potential to escalate because there is no shared framework for de-escalation. Diplomacy is constant, urgent, often secret, working to prevent small frictions from becoming catastrophic ruptures. The successes are invisible. The world simply continues. The failures would be spectacular, and the knowledge of what failure would mean shapes every decision. Military forces remain on alert across the decades. Conscription continues in most territories. Young men and increasingly young women pulled into service that is described as defensive but feels like preparation. They drill, they train, they maintain equipment that is constantly upgraded to match potential adversaries. The weapons stockpiles grow, both conventional and nuclear. Defense budgets consume resources that might have gone to education, to healthcare, to infrastructure. The argument is always the same. Security requires it. The alternative is unthinkable. Intelligence services expand in scope and sophistication. Every state develops apparatus for espionage, for counterintelligence, for monitoring both external threats and internal dissent. The distinction between foreign and domestic intelligence blurs. Technologies for surveillance become more powerful. Wiretaps, informant networks, eventually computers that can process vast amounts of data, looking for patterns that might indicate threat. The panopticon is not built all at once, but assembled piece by piece, each addition justified by necessity. Cultural exchange programs exist, but are carefully managed. Students who study abroad are vetted carefully before departure and debriefed upon return. Artists who travel are expected to represent national interests. Defections occur and cause scandals. Musicians who refuse to return, scholars who request asylum, athletes who disappear during competitions. Each case is analysed for what it reveals about conditions on the other side, for what it might indicate about cracks in loyalty. The language people use to describe their world reflects the peculiarity of the situation. They speak of the situation when they mean the standoff, of the other side when they mean the territories beyond the line, of difficult times when they mean conditions that have persisted for decades. Euphemism becomes endemic because direct naming feels either dangerous or pointless. The result is a discourse that is elusive, indirect, requiring context to decode. Historical analogies are drawn constantly, often incorrectly. People reach for comparisons to earlier periods of frozen conflict, to empires that maintained control through combinations of force and administration, to previous eras when the world was divided. But the comparisons never quite fit because the scale is unprecedented, because the technologies are different, because the nuclear dimension creates a floor of catastrophic risk that earlier periods did not have. Philosophy and social theory attempt to make sense of the condition. Existentialists write about living in bad faith, about the ways people accommodate themselves to systems they privately despise. Political theorists map the structures of power, trying to understand how control is maintained without constant coercion, how systems reproduce themselves across generations. Critical voices emerge from underground presses, circulated hand to hand, arguing for alternatives that seem impossible within current constraints, but perhaps possible in some imagined future. Religious institutions navigate complex relationships with power. Some accommodate, finding ways to maintain their institutions by avoiding confrontation with the state. Others resist, sometimes openly, more often quietly, offering spaces where alternative values can be articulated and lived. Churches, temples, mosques become sites of both conformity and dissent, often simultaneously, with different layers of activity visible depending on who is looking. The question of whether the armistice was inevitable or could have been avoided becomes a topic of endless historical debate. Scholars in different regions working from different archives with different levels of access produce competing accounts. Some argue that continuation was possible, that with different leadership or different strategies the war could have been won. Others contend that the limits were real, that the armistice was the least bad option available given the constraints. The debate is unresolvable because the counterfactuals cannot be tested, but it continues because the question of whether the world had to be this way remains urgent. As the century moves toward its end, the generation that remembers the war begins to disappear entirely. Their passing removes the last direct link to the before times, to the world that existed prior to the conflict and the frozen peace that followed. History becomes fully history, no longer living memory. This changes how it is taught, how it is remembered, what lessons are drawn from it. The armistice, once a traumatic rupture, becomes simply the origin point of the current order, the moment when the world took the shape it has kept. Younger generations, who have never known anything else, have different relationships to the situation. For them, the divisions are not wounds but facts. The borders are not lines of control but simply borders. The constraints are not impositions but the structure within which life happens. This creates a certain kind of pragmatism, less anger at the situation, less longing for alternative, more focus on navigating what is. But it also creates, in some, a hunger for something more, a sense that this frozen condition cannot be the final state of human affairs, that history must eventually move again. Social movements that emerge in this later period have a different character than the resistance of earlier decades. They are less about restoration, less about returning to a previous state, more about pushing towards something new that has never existed. They take up causes that transcend the Cold War divisions: environmental protection, human rights, economic justice. They try to build networks across the lines, connections that bypass official channels. Their success is limited but not zero. Small spaces of cooperation open, tentative and fragile but real. Technology continues to evolve, and with it new possibilities and new dangers. Computing becomes more powerful, enabling surveillance but also encryption, control but also coordination among resistors. The arms race extends into new domains: cyber capabilities, space-based systems, bioweapons. Each technological frontier becomes a new arena of competition, with a familiar pattern repeating. One side achieves advantage, others scramble to catch up, equilibrium is re-established at a higher level of destructive potential. The environmental degradation that was ignored for decades begins to produce unavoidable consequences. Crops fail, water supplies are contaminated, weather patterns shift. These problems do not respect borders, and addressing them requires cooperation that the system makes difficult. Some coordination happens driven by shared necessity, but it is grudging and incomplete. The possibility exists for crisis to force integration, but also for crisis to deepen divisions as regions fight over shrinking resources. Economic pressures mount as the inefficiencies of divided systems compound. Growth slows, living standards stagnate, younger generations face worse prospects than their parents. This creates internal pressures within territories, labour unrest, political movements demanding reform, brain drain as talented people seek opportunities elsewhere. The stability that was supposed to be the dividend of the frozen peace begins to look less stable. At the same time, the sheer passage of time has created constituencies invested in the current order. Industries have grown up around defence production, Bureaucracies have expanded to manage the systems of control. Political careers have been built on expertise in navigating the standoff. Change, even change that might be beneficial in aggregate, threatens specific interests that have power and will resist. The inertia of institutions becomes its own force, making transformation difficult even when it is desired. Late in the century, events in one region begin to shift the calculus. Perhaps economic collapse in a controlled territory creates an opening. Perhaps a new generation of leaders emerges with different priorities. Perhaps a near-miss nuclear incident frightens everyone into reconsidering the sustainability of the status quo. The details vary depending on where you look, but a sense grows that the frozen peace cannot persist indefinitely, that something will have to give. The final decades of the century are marked by this tension between inertia and incipient change. The old structures remain in place, but cracks appear. Protests break out and are suppressed, but they leave traces. Unofficial publications multiply despite crackdowns. Cross-border contacts increase despite monitoring. The system maintains itself, but maintaining itself requires ever more effort, more resources, more attention to threats that come from within as well as from without. And yet, as the century closes, the fundamental fact remains. The world is still divided by lines that were drawn when the fighting stopped decades ago. The armistice has not resolved into a real peace, but neither has it collapsed back into war. The standoff continues, transformed by time but not transcended, a permanent condition that 3 generations have now lived within. The question of what comes next remains open, hanging over everything like the rain that falls steadily on this black screen, neither beginning nor ending, simply continuing, an atmospheric condition that has become the medium through which all life proceeds. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. There is a moment in history that never quite arrived, a collapse that almost happened but didn't, a thread that held when it might have snapped. This is not about great battles won or lost, nor about emperors who suddenly became wise. It's about something quieter, the decision to pay soldiers on time, to keep a harbour dredged, to settle a tax dispute before it turned into a rebellion. Imagine the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, teetering but not falling, its administrative machinery grinding and complaining but still turning. The question is simple. What changes if the roof stays on? The empire does not need to become perfect. It does not need visionary leadership or miraculous reforms. It needs only to avoid the worst of its cascading failures happening all at once. Picture a succession system that stabilizes, not because emperors become saints, but because the army and the Senate find a way to agree on who leads without tearing apart 3 provinces in the process. Picture border defences that receive their pay reliably enough that soldiers stop looking for warlords to follow instead. Picture a tax system that, while never beloved, becomes predictable and locally negotiated rather than a sudden demand that strips a region bare and sends farmers fleeing into the hills. These are not glamorous fixes. They are the dull work of keeping institutions alive. What happens when the machinery keeps running is that the small things, those invisible sinews of trade, communication and habit, do not snap. A merchant in Massilia knows that the grain ships from North Africa will arrive in summer, as they always have. A mason in Lugdunum can still order lead pipes from a supplier 2 provinces away, because the roads are patrolled and the coinage is recognisable. A clerk in Ravenna copies legal precedents into fresh ledgers, knowing that courts in Hispania and Britannia will refer to the same texts. This is the sleepy power of continuity. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. But it changes everything. Consider the Mediterranean as it was, a network of ports, each one a node in a vast system of exchange. Wheat, olive oil, wine, pottery, textiles, metals, slaves, spices and ideas moved across water with a regularity that made the sea less a barrier than a highway. When the Western Empire began to fracture, that network frayed. Ports silted up because no one dredged them. Pirates returned because no one patrolled. Cities that depended on imported grain began to starve or shrink. Craftsmen who relied on distant materials found their supply chains broken. In our altered history, these breakdowns are delayed or prevented. The state remains organised enough to maintain harbour infrastructure, to keep piracy suppressed, and to ensure that ships can move without being shaken down by a dozen petty warlords along the coast. This steadiness in trade creates a feedback loop. When merchants know their goods will arrive, they invest more. When cities can rely on food, they grow instead of contracting. When coinage remains stable, people trust it, and markets expand rather than retreat into barter. The ancient world ran on credit and contracts as much as on coins, and both required a background of enforceable law and predictable behaviour. If the Western state survives, so does that background. A baker in Burdigala can borrow money to expand his shop because the lender believes the debt will be enforceable in court. A shipbuilder in Londinium can accept payment in promissory notes because he trusts the currency and the legal system behind it. These are not revolutionary changes. They are the accumulation of small confidences repeated across thousands of transactions every day. The survival of the state also means the survival of standards. Weights and measures do not fragment into local variants as quickly. A pound in Gaul is still a pound in Italia. A contract written in one province is still intelligible in another. Shipping schedules, once established, become habits. Repair networks for roads and bridges do not vanish, but are maintained by a continuous bureaucracy. When a bridge washes out, there is still a regional official whose job it is to see it rebuilt, and still a tax base to pay for it. The empire was never efficient, but it was persistent. That persistence, extended, becomes a kind of miracle. Christianity, meanwhile, continues its spread, but in this world it grows alongside a functioning state rather than into the vacuum left by collapse. The relationship between church and empire was always complex, full of tension and negotiation, but it was also symbiotic. Bishops became civic leaders in part because civic leaders disappeared. In a world where the Western state endures, bishops still rise in influence, but they do so as partners in governance rather than replacements. The church provides what it always did: charity, education, moral authority, and a network that crosses political boundaries. The state provides what it always did: law, infrastructure, military defense, and administrative reach. This partnership reshapes both institutions. The church becomes more integrated into the machinery of the empire, not in a way that corrupts it entirely, but in a way that makes it a pillar of public life. Bishops sit on councils that advise governors. Monasteries become centres of learning and record-keeping, their libraries growing as the state continues to fund the copying of texts. Church courts handle disputes over morals and family law, while imperial courts handle property and crime, and the two systems learn to coexist and refer cases to each other. The result is a more unified public sphere, where religious and civic identities are not opposed but layered. Doctrine still matters, of course. Theological disputes still flare. Councils still debate the nature of Christ, the role of bishops, the content of Scripture. But these disputes happen within a stable framework. Heresy is less likely to fragment entire regions because the state remains strong enough to enforce a degree of uniformity, and the church is embedded enough to negotiate rather than dictate. The Arian controversy, the Nestorian debate, the Monophysite question, all still occur, but they do not shatter the empire into rival kingdoms. Instead, they become internal arguments within a system that bends but does not break. The survival of Roman legal continuity is perhaps the most profound change. Roman law was one of the empire's great achievements, a body of principles and procedures that organized everything from property disputes to inheritance, from contracts to crimes. When the Western Empire collapsed, that legal tradition survived in fragments, preserved by the Church, remembered in barbarian codes, eventually rediscovered and revived in the Middle Ages. But in our alternate history, it never needs rediscovering. It simply continues. Imagine a Europe where courts operate with the same basic legal framework from Spain to Britain to North Africa. Property law is standardized. Contracts are enforceable across provinces. Citizenship is not a dead concept, but a living one, evolving slowly as the empire evolves. In the historical Middle Ages, law became hyperlocal and personal, tied to feudal relationships and customary practice. In this alternate timeline, law remains imperial and procedural, tied to documents and courts. A farmer in Gaul can appeal to the same legal principles as a merchant in Syria. A woman in Britannia can inherit property under the same rules as a woman in Italia. This legal continuity does not mean justice is perfect or equal. Roman law was full of inequalities, between citizens and non-citizens, between men and women, between free and enslaved. But it was also flexible and capable of reform. Over centuries, as the empire endures, those reforms accumulate. Citizenship expands, legal protections grow. The harsh edges are slowly filed down, not through sudden revolution, but through the steady work of jurists, legislators, and pressure from below. The medieval concept of the king's justice never fully replaces the idea of the law, because the law remains older and more authoritative than any single ruler. Language, too, follows a different path. Latin was always evolving, splitting into regional dialects that would become French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, and Portuguese. But that evolution was accelerated by the collapse of schools, the fragmentation of administration, and the isolation of regions. In a world where the Western state survives, Latin changes more slowly. Schools remain open, teaching a standardized form of the language. Bureaucrats continue to write in Latin across provinces, creating a common written standard. Churches conduct liturgy in Latin everywhere, reinforcing a shared linguistic backbone. Regional dialects still develop, of course. A farmer in Gaul does not speak the same Latin as a clerk in Rome, but the distance between them is smaller. The educated elite across the empire can still communicate easily. Legal documents, religious texts, and administrative orders all use a Latin that remains mutually intelligible. The linguistic map of Europe does not fracture into a dozen incomprehensible tongues. Instead, a diglossia emerges, local spoken forms for daily life, formal Latin for writing, and official business. This linguistic unity makes cultural and intellectual exchange easier. Ideas spread faster. Innovations are shared more readily. The sense of a common civilization persists. Knowledge becomes cumulative in a way it was not in our history. The ancient world had achieved remarkable things. Aqueducts, concrete public health systems, surveying techniques, legal codes, agricultural manuals, medical texts, philosophical treatises. Much of that knowledge was lost or forgotten in the West after Rome's collapse, only to be painstakingly recovered centuries later. In this alternate timeline, the knowledge never vanishes. It is maintained, copied, taught, and slowly improved. Libraries do not burn or decay into ruin. They are maintained by the state and the church, their collections growing rather than shrinking. Monasteries become centres of learning, but so do imperial academies, which continue to train administrators, lawyers, and engineers. Medical knowledge advances incrementally as texts are preserved, and physicians share their findings across provinces. Architectural techniques improve as engineers have access to centuries of accumulated records. Agricultural methods spread as manuals are copied and distributed. Shipbuilding becomes more sophisticated as each generation builds on the last. Sanitation systems are not only maintained but expanded as cities grow and the state invests in public health. This does not mean progress is rapid or dramatic. Ancient technology had real limits, and those limits do not disappear, but the baseline is higher. The floor beneath which knowledge does not fall is much higher. A medieval mason in this timeline has access to Roman construction manuals that were never lost. A medieval physician has access to Galen and Hippocrates, not as distant legends, but as the foundation of his training. A medieval lawyer has access to the entire corpus of Roman legal thought, continuously updated and annotated. The result is a civilization that does not need a renaissance to rediscover its past, because it never fully lost it. The political structure of this enduring empire evolves, but it does not remain static. The centralized autocracy of the late Roman Empire was always fragile, dependent on the personality of the emperor and the loyalty of the army. In a world where the state survives, it must adapt. Over centuries, a kind of imperial federation emerges. Provinces gain more autonomy, managing their own affairs while acknowledging the emperor's authority. Regional assemblies grow in power, negotiating taxes and laws. With the centre, cities retain their ancient privileges and expand them, becoming semi-autonomous units within the larger framework. This is not a smooth or peaceful process. There are rebellions, civil wars, and power struggles, but they are different from the wars that followed Rome's collapse. They are fights within a system, not fights to replace the system entirely. A rebellious governor in Gaul is not trying to become an independent king, but to renegotiate his relationship with the emperor. A powerful general in Hispania is not carving out a new kingdom, but maneuvering for influence within the imperial hierarchy. The conflicts are political rather than civilizational. They are about power and resources, not about erasing the past and starting over. The result is a Europe that, by the year 1000, looks very different from ours. There is still an emperor in Ravenna or Rome, acknowledged from Britannia to North Africa. Beneath him, provinces have wide latitude to govern themselves, but they share a common legal system, a common currency, and a common administrative language. Cities are larger and more prosperous, connected by roads and sea routes that have never fallen into disrepair. Trade is vigorous, not only within the empire but beyond it, as Roman merchants reach into the Baltic, down the African coast, and across the Indian Ocean. The Church is powerful, but it's one institution among others, not the sole inheritor of Roman authority. This alternate Europe is not a utopia. It has poverty, inequality, slavery and oppression. It has wars, famines, and plagues. But it is more connected, more literate, more legally ordered, and more institutionally stable. The medieval period, as we know it, does not quite exist. There is no Dark Age because the lights never fully went out. There is no sudden revival of learning because learning never collapsed. There is no feudalism in the same form because centralized authority never disappeared entirely. Instead, there is a long, slow evolution, a civilization that changes but does not break, that reforms but does not restart. Imagine walking through a city in this world. The streets are paved, as they have been for centuries. The aqueduct still brings clean water from the hills. The forum is still the centre of public life, where merchants haggle, lawyers argue, and officials post notices. The basilica, where the bishop preaches, is built in a style that blends Roman and Christian elements, with mosaics depicting saints alongside classical motifs. The courthouse operates under laws that stretch back 1,000 years, updated and annotated by generations of jurists. The harbour is busy with ships from Alexandria, Carthage and Constantinople, their cargoes inventoried by clerks using forms that their ancestors would recognise. This is not a frozen world. Fashion changes, architecture evolves, new technologies appear, better ploughs, new crops, innovations in metalworking. But the changes are built on a foundation that was never shattered. The sense of continuity is palpable. A citizen of this alternate 10th century could visit a library and read documents from the 5th century, written in a Latin that is still comprehensible. He could visit a court and see legal arguments made using precedents from centuries earlier. He could travel across the empire and find the same coinage, the same weights and measures, the same basic legal rights. The intellectual life of this empire is richer and more continuous. Philosophers still debate Plato and Aristotle, but they do so in an unbroken tradition that includes the Church Fathers, the late Roman commentators, and the medieval scholars who followed. Mathematicians build on Euclid and Archimedes without needing to rediscover them through Arabic translations. Engineers study Vitruvius not as a recovered treasure, but as a standard textbook. The scientific method, such as it exists in this pre-modern world, is more systematic because the institutions that support scholarship, universities, academies, libraries, are older and more stable. Medicine advances more steadily. The medical schools of Alexandria and Rome never closed, and their traditions continued uninterrupted. Physicians still rely on ancient authorities like Galen, but they add to that knowledge with each generation. Dissection is still controversial, limited by religious and cultural taboos, but it happens more often than in our timeline because institutional support exists. Hospitals, originally founded by the Church, expand with state funding. Public health measures, quarantines, sanitation laws, clean water supplies are maintained and improved. The Great Plagues still come because the biological realities have not changed, but responses are more organised and less catastrophic. Agriculture benefits from continuity as well. Roman agricultural manuals like those of Columella and Varro remain standard references. Estates are managed with long-term planning, crop rotation is understood and practiced, and innovation spread through a network of landowners and administrators who can read and correspond. The medieval agricultural revolution, the heavy plough, the three-field system, the horse collar, still happens, but it happens within a framework of existing knowledge. Farmers are not starting from scratch but improving on methods that were never entirely lost. Trade routes extend further and more reliably. The Silk Road remains active, but now Roman merchants are organised and protected by a state that negotiates treaties and enforces contracts. The Indian Ocean trade is dominated by Roman and Persian merchants, their ships larger and better built because shipbuilding techniques have been preserved and refined. The Baltic trade brings amber and furs into the empire, exchanged for wine, oil, and manufactured goods. The African trade brings gold, ivory and slaves north, while Roman glassware, pottery, and textiles flow south. The economy is more monetized and more integrated, with banking and credit systems that span continents. This economic vitality feeds back into the state. Tax revenues are higher because the economy is more productive. The state can afford to maintain its roads, its aqueducts, its fortifications. It can fund schools and libraries. It can pay its soldiers and sailors. It can invest in infrastructure projects, new harbours, new bridges, new public buildings. The state is not universally loved, and taxes are still resented, but the benefits of the state are visible and tangible. People grumble about taxes, but they also appreciate the roads, the courts, the peace, and the order. The military evolves as well. The late Roman army was a mixture of professional soldiers, barbarian federati, and local militias. In this alternate timeline, the army remains a professional force, paid and equipped by the state. It still recruits heavily from the provinces, including from beyond the borders, but those recruits are integrated into a Roman military tradition. They learn Latin, they swear oaths to the emperor, they adopt Roman tactics and equipment. The result is an army that is effective, loyal, and sustainable. Border defences remain strong, and while there are still invasions and raids, they are repelled or absorbed rather than overwhelming the empire. The relationship with the barbarian peoples beyond the borders is different as well. In our history, the collapse of the Western Empire led to the creation of successor kingdoms ruled by Germanic peoples, Franks, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Lombards. In this timeline, those peoples still migrate and settle within the empire, but they do so under Roman authority. They become provinces, not independent kingdoms. They adopt Roman law, Roman language, and Roman Christianity. Their leaders are made governors or generals within the imperial system. The cultural exchange is still profound, but it happens within a surviving political framework. The result is a more gradual blending, a synthesis rather than a replacement. The influence of the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium, is also different. In our history, the East and West drifted apart, divided by language, theology, and politics. In this alternate timeline, with the West surviving, the division is less pronounced. The two halves of the empire remain distinct but connected, united by trade, law, and a common Christian identity. There are still theological disputes over icons, over the nature of Christ, over the authority of the Pope versus the Patriarch, but these disputes do not lead to permanent schism. The Church remains more unified, and the empire, though vast and diverse, retains a sense of being a single civilization. This unity extends to the Islamic world as well. When Islam arises in the 7th century, it encounters a Roman Empire that is stronger and more cohesive than in our timeline. The initial Islamic conquests still happen. The energy and conviction of the early Muslim community are not diminished, but the results are different. The eastern provinces, Syria, Egypt, North Africa, are still lost, because the empire cannot hold them against such determined opposition. But the loss is less catastrophic. The empire retrenches, fortifies, and holds the line in Anatolia and the Mediterranean. The Islamic world and the Roman world become two great civilizations facing each other across the sea, trading and fighting, influencing and learning from each other. This ongoing contact between the Roman and Islamic worlds accelerates intellectual exchange. Greek philosophy, preserved and translated by Muslim scholars, flows back into the Roman Empire not as a rediscovery but as a continuation. Arabic numerals and algebra are adopted more quickly. Medical and astronomical knowledge is shared. The rivalry is real and sometimes violent, but it is also productive. Both civilizations are enriched by the encounter. The Europe that emerges from this history is not the Europe we know. The nation-states that define modern Europe, France, Spain, England, Germany, do not form in the same way. Instead, there are imperial provinces with distinct identities but shared institutions. Gaul is not France. It is a province of the empire with its own dialect, customs and traditions, but also with Roman law, Roman administration, and a sense of belonging to a larger whole. Hispania is not Spain. It is a diverse region that includes Latin-speaking Christians, Berber settlers, and Jewish communities, all living under the same legal system. Britannia is not England. It is a remote province, less Romanized than the south, but still connected to the Mediterranean world by trade, law, and language. This does not mean local identities disappear. On the contrary, regional cultures flourish within the imperial framework. The empire is not a monolith, but a mosaic, a collection of distinct pieces held together by shared institutions. People identify as Gallic or Hispanic or British, but they also identify as Roman, as citizens of a common civilization. This dual identity, local and imperial, shapes politics, culture, and daily life. The cities of this empire are the heart of its civilization. Urbanization never reversed as it did in our timeline. Cities like Rome, Ravenna, Milan, Lyon, Cordoba, London, and Carthage remain large and vibrant. They are centers of trade, learning, administration, and culture. They have public baths, theatres, libraries, and forums. They are connected by roads and sea routes that make travel relatively safe and fast. A merchant or scholar can travel from one end of the empire to the other, finding familiar institutions and languages in each city. This mobility fosters a cosmopolitan culture, where ideas and innovations spread quickly. The countryside is different too. In our history, the collapse of the empire led to the rise of self-sufficient estates and the decline of markets. In this timeline, the countryside remains integrated into the market economy. Farmers produce for urban markets, not just for local consumption. They use Roman roads to transport their goods and Roman coinage to buy what they need. They are subject to Roman law and can appeal to Roman courts. The result is a more prosperous and legally protected peasantry. There is still inequality, still exploitation, but the extremes of serfdom do not develop. Farmers are more likely to be free tenants or small landowners than bound labourers. Religion continues to shape this world profoundly. Christianity remains the dominant faith, but it is not monolithic. The church is powerful, but it must negotiate with the state and with local traditions. There are still heresies and schisms, still debates over doctrine and practice, but these conflicts are managed within a stable institutional framework. The church runs schools, hospitals, and charities. It provides moral guidance and spiritual comfort. It also wields political power, but that power is balanced by the emperor, the senate, and the provincial assemblies. The result is a more pluralistic public sphere, where religious and secular authorities coexist and compete. Judaism remains a significant minority within the empire. In our history, Jewish communities faced persecution and expulsion, but they also maintained a presence throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. In this timeline, with Roman law protecting property and contracts, Jewish communities thrive as traders, craftsmen, and scholars. They maintain their own courts and customs, as Roman law allows for communal autonomy. The relationship is not always easy. There are still episodes of violence and discrimination, but the legal framework provides a degree of protection that was absent in the fragmented medieval world. Jewish scholars contribute to the intellectual life of the empire, translating texts, engaging in philosophical debates, and serving as intermediaries in trade with the Islamic world. As centuries pass, the empire continues to evolve. By the year 1200, it looks more like a confederation than a centralized autocracy. The emperor is still the symbolic head, but real power is shared among provincial governors, urban councils, church leaders, and military commanders. The system is complex and sometimes chaotic, with constant negotiations and conflicts over authority and resources. But it works. The empire does not collapse. It bends, adapts, and endures. Technology continues to advance, though not at the pace of the modern world. Windmills and watermills spread, harnessing natural power for grinding grain, sawing wood, and powering bellows. Metalworking improves, producing better tools, weapons, and machinery. Printing does not arrive as early as in our timeline, but manuscript production is highly organized, with scriptoria in monasteries and state-run workshops producing standardized texts. The result is higher literacy and wider access to knowledge. The Renaissance as we know it does not happen because it is not needed. There is no sudden rediscovery of classical learning, because classical learning never went away. Instead, there is a continuous intellectual tradition that includes the ancients, the church fathers, and the medieval scholars. Art and literature evolve gradually, experimenting with new forms and styles without the sense of a dramatic break with the past. The humanist ideal of the educated citizen is never lost, because the empire always valued education and civic participation. The Protestant Reformation also looks different. In our history, the Reformation was partly a response to the corruption and rigidity of the medieval church. In this timeline, with the church more integrated into the state and more subject to secular oversight, the same grievances exist but are addressed differently. Reformers call for changes, and some of those changes are implemented through councils and legislation. There are still splits and disputes, but they are less likely to fragment the church entirely. The result is a more diverse but still unified Christian tradition, with different practices and emphases in different regions but a shared institutional framework. The exploration of the wider world also proceeds differently. The Roman Empire already has a presence in North Africa, and it extends that presence southward, driven by trade and curiosity. Roman ships, building on centuries of maritime tradition, venture further down the African coast and across the Atlantic. The encounter with the Americas, when it comes, is different. The Romans, like the Europeans in our history, bring diseases, weapons, and ambitions. But they also bring a more developed legal system, a more bureaucratic approach to colonization, and a more diverse population. The impact on indigenous peoples is still catastrophic, but the nature of colonization is different, more organized, more legalistic, and more complex. This alternate world is not better in every way. It has its own injustices, its own tragedies, its own failures. Slavery persists longer in some forms, because the Roman economy relied on it, and because the legal framework that protects property also protects the ownership of people. Women remain subordinate in law and custom, though the continuity of Roman law does provide some protections for property and inheritance. War remains a constant, because human nature has not changed. Disease and famine still devastate populations, because the biological and environmental realities are the same. But this world is also different in important ways. It is more connected, more literate, more legally ordered. It has a stronger sense of history and continuity. It has institutions that are older and more resilient. It has a culture that values education, law, and civic participation. It has avoided the complete collapse and fragmentation that defined the medieval period in our history. The result is a civilization that is richer, more complex, and more capable of managing change. Imagine finally standing in a street in this alternate world. It is raining, and the water runs in channels cut into the stone pavement 1,000 years ago. You take shelter under a colonnade, its columns carved with inscriptions in Latin that you can read if you have had any education. Across the square, a courthouse operates under laws that date back to the Emperor Justinian and beyond, their principles updated by centuries of jurists but recognizable to a lawyer from the ancient world. In the harbour, ships are unloading goods from Alexandria and loading others bound for Londinium, following schedules and routes that have been maintained for generations. Nearby, a church bell rings, calling the faithful to prayer in a building that combines Roman and Christian architectural traditions. This is a world where the thread never broke, where the institutions, habits, and knowledge of the ancient world were passed down, adapted, and built upon. Where the medieval period was not a dark age but a long, slow transformation, where modernity arrived not through a sudden rediscovery of the past, but through a continuous evolution from it. It is not our world. It is a thought experiment, a what-if, a glimpse of how much difference continuity makes. History is not a single explosion, but a chain of small decisions, and sometimes keeping the roof from caving in is enough to change everything. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy.